Chapter 15 of The Black Bag. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Tomcho. The Black Bag by Louis Joseph Vance. Chapter 15. Refugees. Now, if Kirkwood's emotion was poignant, Mrs. Hallam's astonishment paralleled, and her belief transcended it. In order to understand this, it must be remembered that while Mr. Kirkwood was aware of the lady's presence in Antwerp, on her part she had known nothing of him since he had so ungallantly fled her company in Sheerness. She seemed to anticipate that either Calendar or one of his fellows would be discovered at the door. To have surmised it without any excessive degree of pleasure. Only briefly she hesitated, while her surprise swayed her, then with a hardening of the eyes and a curt little nod, "I'm sorry," she said with decision, "but I am busy and can't see you now, Mr. Kirkwood," and attempted to shut the door in his face. Deftly Kirkwood forestalled her intention by inserting both a foot and a corner of the newly purchased handbag between the door and the jamb. He had dared too greatly to be thus dismissed. "Pardon me," he countered unabashed, "but I wish to speak with Miss Calendar." "Dorothy," returned the lady with spirit, "is engaged." She compressed her lips, knitted her brows, and with disconcerting suddenness thrust one knee against the obstructing handbag. Kirkwood, happily, anticipated the movement just in time to reinforce the bag with his own knee. It remained in place, the door standing open. The woman flushed angrily, their glances crossed, her eyes flashing with indignation. But Kirkwood's held them with a level and unyielding stare. "I intend," he told her quietly, "to see Miss Calendar. It's useless your trying to hinder me. We may as well understand each other, madam, and I'll tell you now that if you wish to avoid a scene—" "Dorothy!" the woman called over her shoulder. "Ring for the porter." "By all means," assented Kirkwood agreeably. "I'll send him for a gendarme." "You insolent puppy!" "Madam, your wit disarms me." "What is the matter, Mrs. Hallam?" interrupted a voice from the other side of the door. "Who is it?" "Miss Calendar!" cried Kirkwood hastily, raising his voice. "Mr. Kirkwood!" the reply came on the instant. She knew his voice. "Please, Mrs. Hallam, I will see Mr. Kirkwood." "You have no time to waste with him, Dorothy," said the woman coldly. "I must insist—" "But you don't seem to understand. It is Mr. Kirkwood," argued the girl, as if he were ample excuse for any imprudence. Kirkwood's scant store of patience was by this time rapidly becoming exhausted. "I should advise you not to interfere any further, Mrs. Hallam," he told her in a tone low but charged with meaning. How much did he know? She eyed him an instant longer, in sullen suspicion, then swung open the door, yielding with what grace she could. "Won't you come in, Mr. Kirkwood?" she inquired with acidulated courtesy. "If you press me," he returned winningly. "How can I refuse? You are too good." His impertinence disconcerted even himself. He wondered that she did not slap him as he passed her entering the room, and felt that he deserved it, despite her attitude. But such thoughts could not long trouble one whose eyes were enchanted by the sight of Dorothy, confronting him in the middle of the dingy room, her hands, bristling dangerously with hat pins, busy with the adjustment of a small grey toque atop the wonder that was her hair. So vivacious and charming she seemed, so spirited and bright her welcoming smile. So foreign was she altogether to the picture of her, worn and distraught, that he had mentally conjured up, that he stopped in an extreme of disconcertion and dropped the handbag, smiling sheepishly enough under her ready laugh, mirth irresistibly incited by the plainly read play of expression on his mobile countenance. "You must forgive the unconventionally, Mr. Kirkwood," she apologized, needlessly enough but to cover his embarrassment. "I am on the point of going out with Mrs. Hallam, and of course you are the last person on earth I expected to meet here." "It's good to see you, Miss Calendar," he said simply, remarking with much satisfaction that her trim walking costume bore witness to her statement that she was prepared for the street. The girl glanced into a mirror, patted the small, bewitching hat an infinitesimal fraction of an inch to one side, and turned to him again, her hands free. One of them, small but cordial, rested in his grasp for an instant all too brief, the while he gazed earnestly into her face, noting with concern what the first glance had not shown him, the almost imperceptible shadows beneath her eyes and cheek-bones, pathetic records of the hours the girl had spent, since last he had seen her, in company with his own grim familiar care. Not a little of care and distress of mind had seasoned her portion in those 2 weary days. He saw and knew it, and his throat tightened inexplicably, again as it had out there in the corridor. Possibly the change in her had passed unchallenged by any eyes other than his, but even in the little time that he had spent in her society, the image of her had become fixed so indelibly on his memory that he could not now be deceived. She was changed, a little, but changed. She had suffered and was suffering, and, forced by suffering, her nascent womanhood was stirring in the bud. The child that he had met in London, in Antwerp, he found grown to woman's stature and slowly coming to comprehension of the nature of the change in herself, the wonder of it glowing softly in her eyes. The clear understanding of mankind that is an appanage of woman's estate was now added to the intuitions of a girl's untroubled heart. She could not be blind to the mute adoration of his gaze, nor could she resent it. Beneath it she colored and lowered her lashes. "I was about to go out," she repeated in confusion. It's pleasant to see you, too." "Thank you," he stammered ineptly. If Mr. Kirkwood will excuse us, Dorothy," Mrs. Hallam's sharp tones struck in discordantly, "we shall be glad to see him when we return to London." "I am infinitely complimented, Mrs. Hallam," Kirkwood assured her, and of the girl quickly. "You're going back home?" he asked. She nodded with a faint, puzzled smile that included the woman. After a little, "Not immediately. Mrs. Hallam is so kind—" "Pardon me," he interrupted, "but tell me one thing. Please, have you any one in England to whom you can go without invitation and be welcomed and cared for? Any friends or relations?" "Dorothy will be with me," Mrs. Hallam answered for her, with cold defiance. Deliberately insolent, Kirkwood turned his back to the woman. "Miss Calendar, will you answer my question for yourself?" he asked the girl pointedly. "Why, yes. Several friends. None in London, but—" "Dorothy!" "One moment, Mrs. Hallam," Kirkwood flung crisply over his shoulder. "I'm going to ask you something rather odd, Miss Calendar," he continued, seeking the girl's eyes. "I hope Dorothy, "If you please, Mrs. Hallam," suggested the girl, with just the right shade of independence, "I wish to listen to Mr. Kirkwood. He has been very kind to me and has every right—" She turned to him again, leaving the woman breathless and speechless with anger. "You told me once," Kirkwood continued quickly, and, he felt, brazenly, "that you considered me kind, thoughtful, and considerate. You know me no better today than you did then, but I want to beg you to trust me a little. Can you trust yourself to my protection until we reach your friends in England?" "Why, the girl faltered, taken by surprise. "Mr. Kirkwood!" cried Mrs. Hallam, angrily, finding her voice. Kirkwood turned to meet her onslaught with a mien grave, determined, unflinching. "Please do not interfere, madam," he said quietly. "You are impertinent, sir. Dorothy, I forbid you to listen to this person." The girl flushed, lifting her chin a trifle. "Forbid?" she repeated wonderingly. Kirkwood was quick to take advantage of her resentment. "Mrs. Hallam is not fitted to advise you," he insisted, "nor can she control your actions. It must already have occurred to you that you're rather out of place in the present circumstances. The men who have brought you hither, I believe you already see through to some extent. Forgive my speaking plainly, but that is why you have accepted Mrs. Hallam's offer of protection. Will you take my word for it when I tell you she has not your right interests at heart, but the reverse? I happen to know, Miss Calendar, and I—" "How dare you, sir!" Flaming with rage, Mrs. Hallam put herself bodily between them, confronting Kirkwood in white-lipped desperation, her small, gloved hands clenched and quivering at her sides, her green eyes dangerous. But Kirkwood could silence her, and he did. "Do you wish me to speak frankly, madam? Do you wish me to tell what I know, and all I know," with rising emphasis, "of your social status and your relations with Calendar and Mulready? I promise you that if you wish it, or force me to it—" But he had need to say nothing further. The woman's eyes wavered before his, and a little sob of terror forced itself between her shut teeth. Kirkwood smiled grimly, with a face of brass, impenetrable, inflexible. And suddenly she turned from him, with indifferent bravado. "As Mr. Kirkwood says, Dorothy," she said in her high, metallic voice, "I have no authority over you. But if you're silly enough to consider for a moment this fellow's insulting suggestion, if you're fool enough to go with him, unchaperoned through Europe, and imperil your—" "Mrs. Hallam!" Kirkwood cut her short with a menacing tone. "Why, then, I wash my hands of you," concluded the woman defiantly. "Make your choice, my child," she added with a meaning laugh, and moved away, humming a snatch from a French chanson which brought the hot blood to Kirkwood's face. But the girl did not understand, and he was glad of that. "You may judge between us," he appealed to her directly once more. "I can only offer you my word of honor as an American gentleman that you shall be landed in England, safe and sound, by the first available steamer." "There is no need to say more, Mr. Kirkwood," Dorothy informed him quietly. "I have already decided. I think I begin to understand some things clearly now. If you're ready, we will go." From the window, where she stood, holding the curtains back and staring out, Mrs. Hallam turned with a curling lip. "The honor of an American gentleman," she quoted with a stinging sneer. "I'm sure I wish you comfort of it, child." "We must make haste, Miss Calendar," said Kirkwood, ignoring the implication. "Have you a traveling bag?" She silently indicated a small valise, closed and strapped, on a table by the bed, and immediately passed out into the hall. Kirkwood took the case containing the Gladstone bag in one hand, the girl's valise in the other, and followed. As he turned the head of the stairs he looked back. Mrs. Hallam was still at the window, her back turned. From her very passiveness he received an impression of something ominous and forbidding. If she had lost a trick or two of the game she played, she still held cards, was not at the end of her resources. She stuck in his imagination for many an hour as a force to be reckoned with. For the present he understood that she was waiting to apprise Calendar and Mulready of their flight. With the more haste, then, he followed Dorothy down the 3 flights, through the tiny office, where Madame sat sound asleep at her overburdened desk, and out. Opposite the door they were fortunate enough to find a fiacre drawn up in waiting at the curb. Kirkwood opened the door for the girl to enter. "Gare du Sud," he directed the driver. "Drive your fastest. Double fare for quick time." The driver awoke with a start from profound reverie, looked Kirkwood over, and bowed with gesticulative palms. "Monsieur, I am desolated but engaged," he protested. "Precisely." Kirkwood deposited the 2 bags on the forward seat of the conveyance, and stood back to convince the man. "Precisely," said he, undismayed. "The lady who engaged you is remaining for a time. I will settle her bill." "Very well, monsieur." The driver disclaimed responsibility, and accepted the favor of the gods with a speaking shrug. "Monsieur said the Gare du Sud. En voiture." Kirkwood jumped in and shut the door. The vehicle drew slowly away from the curb, then, with gratifying speed, hammered upstream to the embankment. Bending forward, elbows on knees, Kirkwood watched the sidewalks narrowly, partly to cover the girl's constraint, due to Mrs. Hallam's attitude, partly on the lookout for Calendar and his confederates. In a few moments they passed a public clock. "We've missed the Flushing boat," he announced. "I'm making a try for the Hoek van Holland line. We may possibly make it. I know that it leaves by the Sud Quai, and that's all I do know," he concluded with an apologetic laugh. "And if we miss that?" asked the girl, breaking silence for the first time since they had left the hotel. "We'll take the first train out of Antwerp." "Where to?" "Wherever the first train goes, Miss Calendar. The main point is to get away to night. That we must do, no matter where we land or how we get there. To morrow we can plan with more certainty." "Yes." Her assent was more a sigh than a word. The cab, dashing down the rue Leopold de Wael, swung into the Place du Sud before the station. Kirkwood, acutely watchful, suddenly thrust head and shoulders out of his window (fortunately it was the one away from the depot) and called up to the driver: "Don't stop! Gare Centrale now, and treble fare." "Oui, monsieur. Allons!" The whip cracked and the horse swerved sharply around the corner into the Avenue du Sud. The young man, with a hushed exclamation, turned in his seat, lifting the flap over the little peephole in the back of the carriage. He had not been mistaken. Calendar was standing in front of the station, and it was plain to be seen, from his pose, that the madly careering fiacre interested him more than slightly. Irresolute, perturbed, the man took a step or two after it, changed his mind, and returned to his post of observation. Kirkwood dropped the flap and turned back to find the girl's wide eyes searching his face. He said nothing. "What was that?" she asked after a patient moment. "Your father, Miss Calendar," he returned uncomfortably. There fell a short pause. Then: "Why, will you tell me, is it necessary to run away from my father, Mr. Kirkwood?" she demanded with a moving little break in her voice. Kirkwood hesitated. It were unfeeling to tell her why, yet it was essential that she should know, however painful the knowledge might prove to her. And she was insistent. He might not dodge the issue. "Why?" she repeated as he paused. "I wish you wouldn't press me for an answer just now, Miss Calendar." "Don't you think I had better know?" Instinctively he inclined his head in assent. "Then why—" Kirkwood bent forward and patted the flank of the satchel that held the Gladstone bag. "What does that mean, Mr. Kirkwood?" "That I have the jewels," he told her tersely, looking straight ahead. At his shoulder he heard a low gasp of amazement and incredulity commingled. "But how did you get them? My father deposited them in the bank this morning." "He must have taken them out again. I got them on board the Alethea, where your father was conferring with Mulready and Captain Stryker." "The Alethea!" "Yes." "You took them from those men? You? But didn't my father—" "I had to persuade him," said Kirkwood simply. "But there were 3 of them against you. Mulready wasn't—feeling very well, and Stryker's a coward. They gave me no trouble. I locked them in Stryker's room, lifted the bag of jewels, and came away. I ought to tell you that they were discussing the advisability of sailing away without you, leaving you here friendless and without means. That's why I considered it my duty to take a hand. I don't like to tell you this so brutally, but you ought to know, and I can't see how to tone it down," he concluded awkwardly. "I understand." But for some moments she did not speak. He avoided looking at her. The fiacre, rolling at top speed but smoothly on the broad avenues that encircle the ancient city, turned into the Avenue de Kaiser, bringing into sight the Gare Centrale. "You don't know," began the girl without warning, in a voice gusty with sobs. "Steady on," said Kirkwood gently. "I do know. But don't let's talk about it now. We'll be at the station in a minute, and I'll get out and see what's to be done about a train, if neither Mulready or Stryker are about. You stay in the carriage. No," he changed his mind suddenly, "I'll not risk losing you again. It's a risk we'll have to run in company." "Please," she agreed brokenly. The fiacre slowed up and stopped. "Are you all right, Miss Calendar?" Kirkwood asked. The girl sat up, lifting her head proudly. "I am quite ready," she said, steadying her voice. Kirkwood reconnoitered through the window while the driver was descending. Gare Centrale, monsieur," he said, opening the door. "No one in sight," Kirkwood told the girl. "Come, please." He got out and gave her his hand, then paid the driver, picked up the two bags, and hurried with Dorothy into the station to find in waiting a string of cars into which people were moving at leisurely rate. His inquiries at the ticket window developed the fact that it was the 22:26 for Brussels, the last train leaving the Gare Centrale that night, and due to start in 10 minutes. The information settled their plans for once and all. Kirkwood promptly secured through tickets, also purchasing reserve supplementary tickets, which entitled them to the use of those modern corridor coaches which take the place of first-class compartments on the Belgian state railways. "It's a pleasure," said Kirkwood lightly, as he followed the girl into one of these, "to find oneself in a common-sense sort of a train again. Feels like home." He put their luggage in one of the racks and sat down beside her, chattering with simulated cheerfulness in a vain endeavor to lighten her evident depression of spirits. "I always feel like a traveling anachronism in one of your English trains," he said. "You can't appreciate—" The girl smiled bravely. "And after Brussels?" she inquired. "The first train for the coast," he said promptly. "Dover, Ostend, Boulogne. Whichever proves handiest, no matter which, so long as it gets us on English soil without undue delay." She said "Yes" abstractedly, resting an elbow on the window sill and her chin in her palm to stare with serious, sweet brown eyes out into the arc-smitten night that hung beneath the echoing roof. Kirkwood fidgeted in despite of the constraint he placed himself under, to be still and not disturb her needlessly. Impatience and apprehension of misfortune obsessed his mental processes in equal degree. The 10 minutes seemed interminable that elapsed ere the grinding couplings advertised the imminence of their start. The guards began to bawl, the doors to slam, belated travellers to dash madly for the coaches. The train gave a preliminary lurch ere settling down to its league-long inland dash. Kirkwood, in a fever of hope and an ague of fear, saw a man sprint furiously across the platform and throw himself on the forward steps of their coach on the very instant of the start. Presently he entered by the forward door and walked slowly through, narrowly inspecting the various passengers. As he approached the seats occupied by Kirkwood and Dorothy Calendar, his eyes encountered the young man's, and he leered evilly. Kirkwood met the look with one that was like a kick, and the fellow passed with some haste into the car behind. "Who is that?" demanded the girl without moving her head. "How did you know?" he asked, astonished. "You didn't look. I saw your knuckles whiten beneath the skin. Who was it?" "Hobbs," he acknowledged bitterly, "the mate of the Alethea." "I know. And you think—" "Yes. He must have been ashore when I was on board the brigantine. He certainly wasn't in the cabin. Evidently they hunted him up, or ran across him, and pressed him into service. You see, they're watching every outlet. But we'll win through. Never fear." End of Chapter 15. Recording by William Tomcho.
Chapter 16, Part 1 of The Black Bag. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michele Eaton. The Black Bag by Louis Joseph Vance. Chapter 16, Part 1. Travels with a Chaperon. The train, escaping the outskirts of the city, remarked the event with an exultant shriek, then settled down, droning steadily, to night-devouring flight. In the corridor car, the few passengers disposed themselves to drowse away the coming hour, the short hour's ride that, in these piping days of frantic travelling, separates Antwerp from the capital city of Belgium. A guard, slamming gustily in through the front door, reeled unsteadily down the aisle. Kirkwood, rousing from a profound reverie, detained him with a gesture and began to interrogate him in French. When he departed presently, it transpired that the girl was unacquainted with that tongue. "I didn't understand, you know," she told him with a slow, shy smile. "I was merely questioning him about the trains from Brussels to-night. We daren't stop, you see. We must go on, keep Hobbs on the jump and lose him if possible. That's where our advantage lies, in having only Hobbs to deal with. He's not particularly intellectual, and we've 2 heads to his 1. Besides, if we can prevent him from guessing our destination and wiring back to Antwerp, we may win away. You understand?" "Perfectly," she said, brightening. "And what do you purpose doing now?" "I can't tell yet. The guard's gone to get me some information about the night trains on other lines. In the meantime, don't fret about Hobbs. I'll answer for Hobbs." "I shan't be worried," she said simply, "with you here." Whatever answer he would have made, he was obliged to postpone because of the return of the guard, with a handful of timetables, and, when rewarded with a modest gratuity, the man had gone his way, and Kirkwood turned again to the girl. She had withdrawn her attention for the time. Unconscious of his bold regard, she was dreaming, her thoughts at loose ends, her eyes studying the incalculable depths of blue-black night that swirled and eddied beyond the window glass. The most shadowy of smiles touched her lips. The faintest shade of deepened colour rested on her cheeks. She was thinking of him. As long as he dared, the young man, his heart in his own eyes, watched her greedily, taking a miser's joy of her youthful beauty, striving with all his soul to analyse the enigma of that most inscrutable smile. It baffled him. He could not say of what she thought, and told himself bitterly that it was not for him, a pauper, to presume a place in her meditations. He must not forget his circumstances, nor let her tolerance render him oblivious to his place, which must be a servant's, not a lover's. The better to convince himself of this, he plunged desperately into a forlorn attempt to make head or tail of Belgian railway schedule, complicated as these of necessity are by the alternation from normal time notation to the abnormal system sanctioned by the government, and vice versa, with every train that crosses a boundary line of the state. So preoccupied did he become in this pursuit that he was subconsciously impressed that the girl had spoken twice, ere he could detach his interest from the exasperatingly inconclusive and incoherent cohorts of ranked figures. "Can't you find out anything?" Dorothy was asking. "Precious little," he grumbled. "I'd give my head for a Bradshaw, only it wouldn't be a fair exchange. There seems to be an express for Bruges leaving the Gare du Nord, Brussels, at 55 minutes after 23 o'clock, and if I'm not mistaken, that's the latest train out of Brussels and the earliest we can catch. If we can catch it. I've never been in Brussels, and heaven only knows how long it would take us to cab it from the Gare du Midi to the Nord." In this statement, however, Mr. Kirkwood was fortunately mistaken. Not only heaven, it appeared, had cognizance of the distance between the 2 stations. While Kirkwood was still debating the question with pessimistic tendencies, the friendly guard had occasion to pass through the coach, and, being tapped, yielded the desired information with entire tractability. It would be a cab ride of perhaps 10 minutes. Monsieur, however, would serve himself well if he offered the driver an advance tip as an incentive to speedy driving. Why? Why, because— here the guard consulted his watch, and Kirkwood very keenly regretted the loss of his own— because this train, announced to arrive in Brussels some 20 minutes prior to the departure of the other, was already late. But yes, a matter of some 10 minutes. Could that not be made up? Ah, monsieur, but who would say? The guard departed, doubtless with private views as to the madness of all English-speaking travellers. "And there we are," commented Kirkwood, in factitious resignation. "If we're obliged to stop overnight in Brussels, our friends will be on our back before we can get out in the morning. If they have to come by motor car," he reflected bitterly on the fact that, with but a little more money at his disposal, he too could hire a motor car and cry defiance to their persecutors. "However," he amended with rising spirits, "so much the better our chance of losing Mr. Hobbs. We must be ready to drop off the instant the train stops." He began to unfold another timetable, threatening again to lose himself completely, and was thrown into the utmost confusion by the touch of the girl's hand in appeal placed lightly on his own, and had she been observant she might have seen a second time his knuckles whiten beneath the skin, as he asserted his self-control, though this time not over his temper. His eyes, dumbly eloquent, turned to meet hers. She was smiling. "Please," she iterated, with the least imperative pressure on his hand, pushing the folder aside. "I beg pardon," he muttered blankly. "Is it quite necessary now to study those schedules? Haven't you decided to try for the Bruges Express?" "Why, yes, but—" "Then don't leave me to my thoughts all the time, Mr. Kirkwood." There was a tremor of laughter in her voice, but her eyes were grave and earnest. "I'm very weary of thinking round in a circle, and that," she concluded, with a nervous little laugh, "is all I've had to do for days." "I'm afraid I'm very stupid," he humoured her. "This is the second time, you know, in the course of a very brief acquaintance, that you have found it necessary to remind me to talk to you." "Oh," she brightened, "that night at the Pless. But that was ages ago." "It seems so," he admitted. "So much has happened." "Yes," he assented vaguely. She watched him, a little piqued by his absent-minded mood for a moment. Then, and not without a trace of malice, "Must I tell you again what to talk about?" she asked. "Forgive me. I was thinking about, if not talking to, you. I've been wondering why it was that you left the Alethea at Queensborough to go on by steamer." And immediately he was sorry that his tactless query had swung the conversation to bear upon her father, the thought of whom could not but prove painful to her. But it was too late to mend matters. Already her evanescent flush of amusement had given place to remembrance. "It was on my father's account," she told him in a steady voice, but with averted eyes. "He is a very poor sailor, and the promise of a rough passage terrified him. I believe there was a difference of opinion about it, he disputing with Mr. Mulready and Captain Stryker. That was just after we had left the anchorage. They both insisted that it was safer to continue by the Alethea, but he wouldn't listen to them, and in the end had his way. Captain Stryker ran the brigantine into the mouth of the Medway and put us ashore just in time to catch the steamer." "Were you sorry for the change?" "I?" She shuddered slightly. "Hardly. I think I hated the ship from the moment I set foot on board her. It was a dreadful place. It was all nightmarish that night, but it seemed most terrible on the Alethea with Captain Stryker and that abominable Mr. Hobbs. I think that my unhappiness had as much to do with my father's insistence on the change as anything. He was very thoughtful most of the time." Kirkwood shut his teeth on what he knew of the blackguard. "I don't know why," she continued, wholly without affectation, "but I was wretched from the moment you left me in the cab to wait while you went in to see Mrs. Hallam. And when we left you at Bermondsey Old Stairs, after what you had said to me, I felt, I hardly knew what to say, abandoned in a way." "But you were with your father, in his care." "I know, but I was getting confused. Until then the excitement had kept me from thinking. But you made me think. I began to wonder, to question. But what could I do?" She signified her helplessness with a quick and dainty movement of her hands. "He is my father, and I am not yet of age, you know." "I thought so," he confessed, troubled. "It's very inconsiderate of you, you must admit." "I don't understand." "Because of the legal complication. I've no doubt your father can have the law on me," Kirkwood laughed uneasily, "for taking you from his protection." "Protection?" she echoed warmly. "If you call it that." "Kidnapping," he said thoughtfully. "I presume that'd be the charge." "Oh," she laughed the notion to scorn. "Besides, they must catch us first, mustn't they?" "Of course. And," with a simulation of confidence sadly deceitful, "they shan't. Mr. Hobbs to the contrary notwithstanding. You make me share your confidence against my better judgment. I wish your better judgment would counsel you to share your confidence with me." He caught her up. "If you would only tell me what it's all about, as far as you know, I'd be better able to figure out what we ought to do." Briefly the girl sat silent, staring before her with sweet sombre eyes. Then, in the very beginning, she told him with a conscious laugh. This sounds very storybookish, I know. In the very beginning, George Burgoyne Calendar, an American, married his cousin a dozen times removed, and an Englishwoman, Alice Burgoyne Hallam. Hallam? Wait, please. She sat up, bending forward and frowning down upon her interlacing gloved fingers. She was finding it difficult to say what she must. Kirkwood watched hungrily the fair drooping head, the flawless profile clear and radiant against the night-blackened window, saw hot signals of shame burning on her cheek and throat and forehead. "But never mind," he began awkwardly. "No," she told him with decision. "Please let me go on." She continued, stumbling, trusting to his sympathy to bridge the gaps in her narrative. "My father, there was trouble of some sort. At all events, he disappeared when I was a baby. My mother died. I was brought up in a home of my great-uncle, Colonel George Burgoyne of the Indian Army, retired. My mother had been his favourite niece, they say. I presume that was why he cared for me. I grew up in his home in Cornwall. It was my home, just as he was my father in everything but fact. A year ago he died, leaving me everything. The townhouse in Frognall Street, his estate in Cornwall, everything was willed to me on condition that I must never live with my father, nor in any way contribute to his support. If I disobeyed, the entire estate without reserve was to go to his nearest of kin. Colonel Burgoyne was unmarried and had no children." The girl paused, lifting to Kirkwood's face her eyes, clear, fearless, truthful. "I never was given to understand that there was anybody who might have inherited, other than myself," she declared. "I see. Last week I received a letter, signed with my father's name, begging me to appoint an interview with him in London. I did so. Guess how gladly. I was alone in the world, and he, my father, whom I had never thought to see. We met at this hotel, the Pless. He wanted me to come and live with him, said that he was growing old and lonely and needed a daughter's love and care. He told me that he had made a fortune in America and was amply able to provide for us both. As for my inheritance, he persuaded me that it was by rights the property of Frederick Hallam, Mrs. Hallam's son." "I have met the young gentleman," interpolated Kirkwood. "His name was new to me, but my father assured me that he was the next of kin mentioned in Colonel Burgoyne's will, and convinced me that I had no real right to the property. After all, he was my father. I agreed. I could not bear the thought of wronging anybody. I was to give up everything but my mother's jewels. It seems, my father said, I can't believe it now." She choked on a little dry sob. It was some time before she seemed able to continue. "I was told that my great-uncle's collection of jewels had been my mother's property. He had in life a passion for collecting jewels, and it had been his whim to carry them with him wherever he went. When he died in Frognall Street, they were in the safe by the head of his bed. I, in my grief, at first forgot them, and then afterwards carelessly put off removing them. To come back to my father, night before last we were to call on Mrs. Hallam. It was to be our last night in England. We were to sail for the Continent on the private yacht of a friend of my father's the next morning. This is what I was told, and believed, you understand. That night Mrs. Hallam was dining at another table at the Pless, it seems. I did not then know her. When leaving, she put a note on our table by my father's elbow. I was astonished beyond words. He seemed much agitated, told me that he was called away on urgent business, a matter of life and death, and begged me to go alone to Frognall Street, get the jewels, and meet him at Mrs. Hallam's later. I wasn't altogether a fool, for I began dimly to suspect then that something was wrong, but I was a fool, for I consented to do as he desired. You understand? You know?" "I do indeed," replied Kirkwood grimly. "I understand a lot of things now that I didn't 5 minutes ago. Please let me think." But the time he took for deliberation was short. He had hoped to find a way to spare her by sparing Calendar, but momentarily he was becoming more impressed with the futility of dealing with her save in terms of candour, merciful though they might seem harsh. "I must tell you," he said, "that you have been outrageously misled, swindled and deceived. I have heard from your father's own lips that Mrs. Hallam was to pay him £2,000 for keeping you out of England and losing you your inheritance. I'm inclined to question, furthermore, the assertion that these jewels were your mother's. Frederick Hallam was the man who followed you into the Frognall Street house and attacked me on the stairs. Mrs. Hallam admits that he went there to get the jewels, but he didn't want anyone to know it. But that doesn't prove. Just a minute. Rapidly and concisely Kirkwood recounted the events wherein he had played a part. Subsequent to the adventure of Bermondsey Old Stairs, he was guilty of but one evasion. On one point only did he slur the truth. He conceived it his honourable duty to keep the girl in ignorance of his straitened circumstances. She was not to be distressed by knowledge of his distress, nor could he tolerate the suggestion of seeming to play for her sympathy. It was necessary, then, to invent a motive to excuse his return to 9 Frognall Street. I believe he chose to exaggerate the inquisitiveness of his nature, and threw in for good measure a desire to recover a prized trinket of no particular moment, esteemed for its associations, and so forth. But whatever the fabrication, it passed muster. To the girl his motive seemed less important than the discoveries that resulted from them. "I am afraid," he concluded the summary of the confabulation he had overheard at the skylight of the Alethea's cabin, "you'd best make up your mind that your father—" "Yes," whispered the girl huskily, and turned her face to the window, a quivering muscle in the firm young throat alone betraying her emotion. "It's a bad business," he pursued relentlessly, "bad all round. Mulready, in your father's pay, tries to have him arrested, the better to rob him. Mrs. Hallam, to secure your property for that precious pet Freddie, connives at if she doesn't instigate a kidnapping. Your father takes her money to deprive you of yours, which could profit him nothing so long as you remained in lawful possession of it, and at the same time he conspires to rob, through you, the rightful owners, if they are rightful owners. And if they are, why does Freddie Hallam go like a thief in the night to secure property that's his beyond dispute? I don't really think you owe your father any further consideration." He waited patiently. Eventually, "No," the girl sobbed assent. "It's this way. Calendar, counting on your sparing him in the end, is going to hound us. He's doing it now. There's Hobbs in the next car for proof. Until these jewels are returned, whether to Frognall Street or to young Hallam, we're both in danger, both thieves in the sight of the law. And your father knows that too. There's no profit to be had by discounting the temper of these people. They're as desperate a gang of swindlers as ever lived. They'll have those jewels if they have to go as far as murder." "Mr. Kirkwood!" she deprecated in horror. He wagged his head stubbornly, ominously. "I've seen them in the Raw. They're hot on our trail now. 10 to 1 they'll be on our backs before we can get across the Channel. Once in England we will be comparatively safe. Until then— But I'm a brute. I'm frightening you." "You are dreadfully," she confessed in a tremulous voice. "Forgive me. If you look at the dark side first, the other seems all the brighter. Please don't worry. We'll pull through with flying colours, or my name's not Philip Kirkwood." "I have every faith in you," she informed him, flawlessly sincere. "When I think of all you've done and dared for me on the mere suspicion that I needed your help—" "We'd best be getting ready," he interrupted hastily. "Here's Brussels." It was so. Lights in little clusters and long wheeling lines were leaping out of the darkness and flashing back as the train rumbled through the suburbs of the little Paris of the North. Already the other passengers were bestirring themselves, gathering together wraps and hand luggage, and preparing for the journey's end. Rising, Kirkwood took down their 2 satchels from the overhead rack and waited, in grim abstraction, planning and counter-planning against the machinations in whose wiles they two had become so perilously entangled. Primarily there was Hobbs to be dealt with, no easy task, for Kirkwood dared not resort to violence nor in any way invite the attention of the authorities, and threats would be an idle waste of breath. In the case of that corrupt and malignant little Cockney, himself as keen as any needle, adept in all the artful resources of the underworld whence he had sprung, and further primed for action by that master rogue Calendar. The train was pulling slowly into the station, when he reluctantly abandoned his little unfeasible scheme for shaking off the little Englishman, and concluded that their salvation was only to be worked out through everlasting vigilance, incessant movement, and the favour of the blind goddess, Fortune. There was comfort of a sort in the reflection that the divinity of chance is at least blind. Her favours are impartially distributed. The swing of the wheel of the world is not always to the advantage of the wrongdoer and the scamp. He saw nothing of Hobbs as they alighted and hastened from the station, and hardly had time to waste looking for him, since their train had failed to make up the precious 10 minutes. Consequently he dismissed the fellow from his thoughts until, with Brussels lingering in their memories, a garish vision of brilliant streets and glowing cafes glimpsed furtively from their cab windows during its wild dash over the broad mid-city boulevards. At midnight they settled themselves in a carriage of the Bruges Express. They were speeding along through the open country with a noisy clatter. Then a minute's investigation sufficed to discover the mate of the Alethea serenely ensconced in the coach behind. The little man seemed rarely complacent, and impudently greeted Kirkwood's scowling visage as the latter peered through the window in the coach door, with a smirk and a waggish wave of his hand. The American, by main strength of will power, mastered an impulse to enter and wring his neck, and returned to the girl, more disturbed than he cared to let her know. There resulted from his review of the case but one plan for outwitting Mr. Hobbs, and that lay in trusting to his confidence that Kirkwood and Dorothy Calendar would proceed as far towards Ostend as the train would take them, namely to the limit of the run, Bruges. Thus inspired, Kirkwood took counsel with the girl, and when the train paused at Ghent, they made an unostentatious exit from their coach, finding themselves, when the express had rolled on into the west, upon a station platform in a foreign city at 9 minutes past 1 o'clock in the morning, but at length without their shadow. Mr. Hobbs had gone on to Bruges. End of chapter 16, part 1. Recording by Michele Eaton. Chapter 16, part 2 of The Black Bag. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michele Eaton. The Black Bag by Louis Joseph Vance. Chapter 16, Part 2. Kirkwood sped his journeyings with an unspoken malediction, and collected himself to cope with a situation which was to prove hardly more happy for them than the espionage they had just eluded. The primal flush of triumph which had saturated the American's humour on this signal success proved but fictive and transitory when inquiry of the station attendants educed the information that the two earliest trains to be obtained were the 5:09 for Dunkirk and the 5:37 for Ostend. A minimum delay of 4 hours was to be endured in the face of many contingent features singularly unpleasant to contemplate. The station waiting room was on the point of closing for the night, and Kirkwood, already alarmed by the rapid ebb of the money he had had of Calendar, dared not subject his finances to the strain of a night's lodging at one of Ghent's hotels. He found himself forced to be cruel to be kind to the girl, and Dorothy's cheerful acquiescence to their sole alternative of tramping the street until daybreak did nothing to alleviate Kirkwood's exasperation. It was permitted them to occupy a bench outside the station. There the girl, her head pillowed on the treasure bag, napped uneasily, while Kirkwood plodded restlessly to and fro, up and down the platform, communing with the shade of care and addling his poor weary wits with the problem of the future. Not so much his own as the future of the unhappy child for whose welfare he had assumed responsibility. Dark for both of them. In his understanding, tomorrow loomed darkest for her. Not until the grey formless light of the dawn dusk was wavering over the land did he cease his perambulations. Then a gradual stir of life in the city streets, together with the appearance of a station porter or two, opening the waiting rooms and preparing them against the traffic of the day, warned him that he must rouse his charge. He paused and stood over her, reluctant to disturb her rest, such as it was. his heart torn with compassion for her, his soul embittered by the cruel irony of their estate. If what he understood were true, a king's ransom was secreted within the cheap imitation leather satchel which served her for a pillow, but it availed her nothing for her comfort. If what he believed were true, she was absolute mistress of that treasure of jewels. Yet that night she had been forced to sleep on a hard, uncushioned bench in the open air, and this morning he must waken her to the life of a hunted thing. A week ago she had had at her command every luxury known to the civilized world. To-day she was friendless, but for his inefficient, worthless self, and in a strange land. A week ago, had he known her then, he had been free to tell her of his love, to offer her the protection of his name, as well as his devotion. To-day he was an all but penniless vagabond, and there could be no dishonour deeper than to let her know the nature of his heart's desire. Was ever lover hedged from a declaration to his mistress by circumstances so hateful, so untoward? He could have raged and railed against his fate like any madman, for he desired her greatly, and she was very lovely in his sight. If her night's rest had been broken, and but a mockery, she showed few signs of it. The faint, wan complexion of fatigue seemed only to enhance the beauty of her maidenhood. Her lips were as fresh and desirous as the dewy petals of a crimson rose. Beneath her eyes soft shadows lurked, where her lashes lay tremulous upon her cheeks of satin. She was to him, of all created things, the most wonderful, the most desirable. The temptation of his longing seemed more than he could long withstand, but resist he must, or part forever with any title to her consideration, or his own. He shut his teeth and knotted his brows in a transport of desire to touch, if only with his fingertips, the woven wonder of her hair. And thus she saw him, when, without warning, she awoke. Bewilderment at first informed the wide brown eyes, then, as their drowsiness vanished, a little laughter, a little tender mirth. "Good morning, Sir Knight of the sombre countenance," she cried, standing up. "Am I so utterly disreputable that you find it necessary to frown on me so darkly?" He shook his head, smiling. "I know I'm a fright," she asserted vigorously, shaking out the folds of her pleated skirt. "And as for my hat, it will never be on straight. But then you wouldn't know." "It seems all right," he replied vacantly. "Then please to try to look a little happier, since you find me quite presentable." "I do." Without lifting her bended head, she looked up, laughing, not ill-pleased. "You'd say so? Really?" Commonplace enough, this banter, this pitiful endeavour to be oblivious of their common misery. But like the look she gave him, her words rang in his head like potent fumes of wine. He turned away, utterly disconcerted for the time, knowing only that he must overcome his weakness. Far down the railway tracks there rose a murmuring that waxed to a rumbling roar. A passing porter answered Kirkwood's inquiry. It was the night boat train from Ostend. He picked up their bags and drew the girl into the waiting room, troubled by a sickening foreboding. Through the window they watched the train roll in and stop. Among others alighted, smirking, the unspeakable Hobbs. He lifted his hat and bowed jauntily to the waiting room window, making it plain that his keen eyes had discovered them instantly. Kirkwood's heart sank with the hopelessness of it all. If the railway directorates of Europe conspired against them, what chance had they? If the night boat train from Ostend had only had the decency to be 25 minutes late, instead of arriving promptly on the minute of 4:45, they too might have escaped by the 5:09 for Dunkirk and Calais. There remained but a single untried ruse in his bag of tricks. Mercifully it might suffice. "Miss Calendar," said Kirkwood from his heart, "just as soon as I get you home safe and sound, I am going to take a day off, hunting up that little villain and flay him alive. In the meantime, I forgot to dine last night, and am reminded that we had better forage for breakfast." Hobbs dogged them at a safe distance while they sallied forth, and in a neighbouring street discovered an early bird bakery. Here they were able to purchase rolls steaming from the oven, fresh pats of golden butter wrapped in clean lettuce leaves, and milk in twin bottles, all of which they prosaically carried with them back to the station, lacking leisure as they did to partake of the food before train time. Without attempting concealment, Hobbs he knew was eavesdropping round the corner of the door. Kirkwood purchased at the ticket window passages on the Dunkirk train. Mr. Hobbs promptly flattered him by imitation, and so jealous of his luck was Kirkwood by this time grown, through continual disappointment, that he did not even let the girl into his plans until they were aboard the 509 in a compartment all to themselves. Then, having with his own eyes seen Mr. Hobbs dodge on to the third compartment in the rear of the same carriage, Kirkwood astonished the girl by requesting her to follow him, and together they left by the door opposite that by which they had entered. The engine was running up and down a scale of staccato snorts in preparation for the race, and the cars were on the edge of moving, couplings clanking, wheels a-groan, ere Mr. Hobbs condescended to join them between the tracks. Wearily disheartened, Kirkwood reopened the door, flung the bags in, and helped the girl back into their despised compartment. The quicker route to England via Ostend was now out of the question. As for himself, he waited for a brace of seconds, eyeing wickedly the ubiquitous Hobbs, who had popped back into his compartment, but stood ready to pop out again at the least encouragement. In the meantime he was pleased to shake a friendly foot at Mr. Kirkwood, thrusting that member out through the half-open door. Only the timely departure of the train, compelling him to rejoin Dorothy at once, if at all, prevented the American from adding murder to the already noteworthy catalogue of his high crimes and misdemeanours. Their simple meal, consumed to the ultimate drop and crumb, while the Dunkirk train meandered serenely through a sunny, smiling Flemish countryside, somewhat revived their jaded spirits. After all, they were young, enviably dowered with youth's exuberant elasticity of mood. The world was bright in the dawning, the night had fled, leaving naught but an evil memory. Best of all things, they were together. Tacitly they were agreed that somehow the future would take care of itself, and all be well with them. For a time they laughed and chattered, pretending that the present held no cares or troubles, but soon the girl, nestling her head in the corner of the dingy cushions, was smiling ever more drowsily on Kirkwood, and presently she slept in good earnest, the warm blood ebbing and flowing beneath the exquisite texture of her cheeks, the ghost of an unconscious smile quivering about the sensitive scarlet mouth, the breeze through the open window at her side wantoning at will in the sunlight witchery of her hair. And Kirkwood, worn with sleepless watching, dwelt in longing upon the dear innocent allure of her, until the ache in his heart had grown well nigh insupportable. Then instinctively turned his gaze upwards, searching his heart, reading the faith and desire of it, so that at length knowledge and understanding came to him of his weakness and strength, and the clean love that he bore for her. And gladdened he sat, dreaming in waking the same clear dreams that modelled her unconscious lips, secretly for laughter and the joy of living. When Dunkirk halted their progress, they were obliged to alight and change cars, Hobbs a discreetly sinister shadow at the end of the platform. By schedule they were to arrive in Calais about the middle of the forenoon, with a wait of 3 hours to be bridged before the departure of the Dover packet. That would be an anxious time. The prospect of it rendered both Dorothy and Kirkwood doubly anxious throughout this final stage of their flight. In 3 hours anything could happen, or be brought about. Neither could forget that it was quite within the bounds of possibilities for Calendar to be awaiting them in Calais. Presuming that Hobbs had been acute enough to guess their plans and advise his employer by telegraph, the latter could readily have anticipated their arrival, whether by sea in the brigantine or by land, taking the direct route via Brussels and Lille. If such proved to be the case, it was scarcely sensible to count upon the arch-adventurer contenting himself with a waiting role like Hobbs. With such unhappy apprehensions for a stimulant, between them the man and the girl contrived a makeshift counter-stratagem, or it were more accurate to say that Kirkwood proposed it, while Dorothy rejected, disputed, and at length accepted it, albeit with sad misgivings, for it involved a separation that might not prove temporary. Together they could never escape the surveillance of Mr. Hobbs. Parted, he would be obliged to follow one or the other. The task of misleading the Alethea's mate Kirkwood undertook. delegating to the girl the duty of escaping when he could provide her the opportunity, of keeping under cover until the hour of sailing, and then proceeding to England with the Gladstone bag, alone if Kirkwood was unable, or thought it inadvisable, to join her on the boat. In furtherance of this design, a majority of the girl's belongings were transferred from her travelling bag to Kirkwood's, the Gladstone taking their place, and the young man provided her with voluminous instructions, a revolver which she did not know how to handle, and declared she would never use for any consideration, and enough money to pay for her accommodation at the Terminus Hotel near the pier, and for 2 passages to London. It was agreed that she should secure the steamer booking, lest Kirkwood be delayed until the last moment. These arrangements concluded, the pair of blessed idiots sat steeped in melancholy silence, avoiding each other's eyes until the train drew in at the Gare Centrale, Calais. In profound silence, too, they left their compartment and passed through the station into the quiet, sun-drenched streets of the seaport, Hobbs hovering solicitously in the offing. Without comment or visible relief of mind, they were aware that their fears had been without apparent foundation. They saw no sign of Calendar, Stryker, or Mulready. The circumstance, however, counted for nothing. One or all of the adventurers might arrive in Calais at any minute. Momentarily, more miserable as the time of parting drew nearer, dumb with unhappiness, they turned aside from the main thoroughfares of the city, leaving the business section, and gained the sleepier side streets, bordered by the residences of the proletariat, where for blocks none but children were to be seen, and of them but few, quaint, sober little bodies playing almost noiselessly in their dooryards. At length Kirkwood spoke. "Let's make it the corner," he said, without looking at the girl. "It's a short block to the next street. You hurry to the terminus and lock yourself in your room. Have the management book both passages. Don't run the risk of going to the pier yourself. I'll make things interesting for Mr. Hobbs and join you as soon as I can, if I can." "You must," replied the girl. "I shan't go without you." "But Miss Calendar!" he exclaimed, aghast. "I don't care. I know I agreed," she declared mutinously. "But I won't. I can't. Remember, I shall wait for you." But perhaps—" "If you have to stay, it will be because there's danger, won't it? And what would you think of me if I deserted you then, after all you've done? Please don't waste time arguing. Whether you come at one today, tomorrow, or a week from tomorrow, I shall be waiting, you may be sure. Good-bye." They had turned the corner, walking slowly side by side. Hobbs for the first time caught off his guard, and dropped behind more than half a long block. But now Kirkwood's quick sidelong glance discovered the mate in the act of taking alarm and quickening his pace. None the less the American was at the time barely conscious of anything other than a wholly unexpected furtive pressure of the girl's gloved fingers on his own. "Good-bye," she whispered. He caught at her hand, protesting. "Dorothy—" "Good-bye," she repeated breathlessly, with a queer little catch in her voice. "God be with you, Philip, and send you safely back to me." And she was running away. Dumbfounded with dismay, seeing in a flash how all his plans might be set at naught by this her unforeseen insubordination, he took a step or two after her, but she was fleet of foot, and remembering Hobbs, he halted. By this time the mate too was running. Kirkwood could hear the heavy pounding of his clumsy feet. Already Dorothy had almost gained the farther corner. As she whisked round it with a flutter of skirts, Kirkwood dodged hastily behind a gate-post. A thought later, Hobbs appeared, head down, chest out, eyes straining for sight of his quarry, pelting along for dear life. As, rounding the corner, he stretched out in swifter stride, Kirkwood was inspired to put a spoke in his wheel, and a foot thrust suddenly out from behind the gate-post accomplished his purpose with more success than he had dared anticipate. Stumbling, the mate plunged headlong, arms and legs a-sprawl, and the momentum of his pace, though checked, carried him along the sidewalk face downwards, a full yard ere he could stay himself. Kirkwood stepped out of the gateway and sheered off, as Hobbs picked himself up, something which he did rather slowly, as if in a daze, without comprehension of the cause of his misfortune, and for a moment he stood pulling his wits together and swaying as though on the point of resuming his rudely interrupted chase, when the noise of Kirkwood's heels brought him about face in a twinkling. "Oh, it's you," he snarled, in a temper as vicious as his countenance, and both of these were much the worse for wear and tear. "Myself," admitted Kirkwood fairly, and then in a gleam of humour. "Weren't you looking for me?" His rage seemed to take the little Cockney and shake him by the throat. He trembled from head to foot, his face shockingly congested, and spat out dust and fragments of lurid blasphemy like an infuriated cat. Of a sudden, "Where's the girl?" he sputtered thickly, as his quick shifting eyes for the first time noted Dorothy's absence. "Miss Calendar has other business, none with you. I've taken the liberty of stopping you because I have a word or two." "Oh, you have you? God strike me blind, but I've a word for you too. Hand over that bag and look nippy, or I'll make you pay for what you've done to me. I'll make you pay," he iterated hoarsely, edging closer. "Hand it over, or—" "You've got another guess," Kirkwood began, but saved his breath in deference to an imperative demand on him for instant defensive action. To some extent he had underestimated the brute courage of the fellow, the violent, desperate courage that is distilled of anger in men of his kind. Despising him, deeming him incapable of any overt act of villainy, Kirkwood had been a little less wary than he would have been with Calendar or Mulready. Hobbs had seen more of the craven type which Stryker graced so conspicuously, but now the American was to be taught discrimination, to learn that if Stryker's nature was like a snake's for low cunning and deviousness, Hobbs's soul was the soul of a viper. Almost imperceptibly he had advanced upon Kirkwood. Almost insensibly his right hand had moved towards his chest now. With a movement marvellously deft, it had slipped in and out of his breast pocket, and a 6-inch blade of tarnished steel was winging towards Kirkwood's throat with the speed of light. Instinctively he stepped back. As instinctively he guarded with his right forearm, lifting the hand that held the satchel. The knife, catching in his sleeve, scratched the arm beneath painfully, and simultaneously was twisted from the mate's grasp, while in his surprise Kirkwood's grip on the bag handle relaxed. It was torn forcibly from his fingers just as he received a heavy blow on his chest from the mate's fist. He staggered back. By the time he had recovered from the shock, Hobbs was a score of feet away, the satchel tucked under his arm, his body bent almost double, running like a jackrabbit. Ere Kirkwood could get under way in pursuit, the mate had dodged out of sight round the corner. When the American caught sight of him again, he was far down the block, and bettering his pace with every jump. He was approaching also some 6 or 8 good citizens of Calais, men of the labouring class at a guess. Their attention attracted by his frantic flight, they stopped to wonder. 1 or 2 moved as though to intercept him, and he doubled out into the middle of the street with the quickness of thought. An instant later he shot round another corner and disappeared, the natives streaming after in hot chase, electrified by the inspiring strains of "Stop, thief!" or its French equivalent. Kirkwood, cheering them on in the same wild cry, followed to the farther street, and there paused, so winded and weak with laughter that he was fain to catch at a fence picket for support. Standing thus, he saw other denizens of Calais spring as if from the ground miraculously to swell the hue and cry, and a dumpling of a gendarme materialised from nowhere at all, to fall in behind the rabble, waving his sword above his head and screaming at the top of his lungs, the while his fat legs twinkled for all the world like thick sausage links marvellously animated. The mob straggled round yet another corner and was gone. Its clamour diminished on the still spring air, and Kirkwood, recovering, abandoned Mr. Hobb to the justice of the high gods and the French system of jurisprudence. At least he hoped the latter would take an interest in the case, if haply Hobbs were laid by the heels, and went his way rejoicing. As for the scratch on his arm, it was nothing, as he presently demonstrated to his complete satisfaction in the seclusion of a chance fiacre. Kirkwood, commissioning it to drive him to the American consulate, made his diagnosis en route, wound a handkerchief round the negligible wound, rolled down his sleeve, and forgot it altogether in the joys of picturing to himself Hobbs in the act of opening the satchel in expectation of finding therein the Gladstone bag. At the consulate door he paid off the driver and dismissed him. The fiacre had served his purpose, and he could find his way to the Terminus Hotel at infinitely less expense. He had a considerably harder task before him as he ascended the steps to the consular doorway, knocked, and made known the nature of his errand. No malicious destiny could have timed the hour of his call more appositely. The consul was at home and at the disposal of his fellow citizens, within bounds. In the course of 30 minutes or so, Kirkwood emerged with dignity from the consulate, his face crimson to the hair, his soul smarting with shame and humiliation, and left an amused official, representative of his country's government, with the impression of having been entertained to the point of ennui by an exceptionally clumsy but pertinacious liar. For the better part of the succeeding hour, Kirkwood circumnavigated the neighbourhood of the steamer pier and the Terminus Hotel, striving to render himself as inconspicuous as he felt insignificant, and keenly on the alert for any sign or news of Hobbs. In this pursuit he was pleasantly disappointed. At noon precisely, his suspense grown too onerous for his strength of will. Throwing caution and their understanding to the winds, he walked boldly into the terminus and inquired for Miss Calendar. The assurance he received that she was in safety under its roof did not deter him from sending up his name and asking her to receive him in the public lounge. He required the testimony of his senses to convince him that no harm had come to her in the long hour and a half that had elapsed since their separation. Womanlike, she kept him waiting. Alone in the public rooms of the hotel, he suffered excruciating torments. How was he to know that Calendar had not arrived and found his way to her? When at length she appeared on the threshold of the apartment, bringing with her the travelling bag, and looking wonderfully the better for her 90 minutes of complete repose and privacy, the relief he experienced was so intense that he remained transfixed in the middle of the floor, momentarily able neither to speak nor to move. On her part, so fagged and distraught did he seem, that at sight of his careworn countenance she hurried to him with outstretched, compassionate hands and a low, pitiful cry of concern, forgetful entirely of that which he himself had forgotten, the emotion she had betrayed on parting. "Oh, nothing wrong," he hastened to reassure her, with a sorry ghost of his familiar grin. "Only I have lost Hobbs and the satchel with your things, and there's no sign yet of Mr. Calendar. We can feel pretty comfortable now, and I thought it's time we had something like a meal." The narrative of his adventure, which he delivered over their déjeuner à la fourchette, contained no mention either of his rebuff at the American consulate, or the scratch he had sustained during Hobbs' murderous assault. The one could not concern her, the other would seem but a bid for her sympathy. He counted it a fortunate thing that the mate's knife had been keen enough to penetrate the cloth of his sleeve without tearing it. The slit it had left was barely noticeable, and he purposely diverted the girl with flashes of humorous description, so that they discussed both meal and episode in a mood of wholesome merriment. It was concluded, all too soon for the taste of either, by the waiter's announcement that the steamer was on the point of sailing. Outwardly composed, inwardly quaking, they boarded the packet, meeting with no misadventure whatever. If we are to accept the circumstance that, when the restaurant bill was settled, and the girl had punctiliously surrendered his change with the tickets, Kirkwood found himself in possession of precisely 1 franc and 20 centimes. He groaned in spirit to think how differently he might have been fixed, had he not, in his infatuated spirit of honesty, been so anxious to give Calendar more than ample value for his money. An inexorable anxiety held them both near the gangway until it was cast off, and the boat began to draw away from the pier. Then, and not till then, did an unimpressive, small figure of a man detach itself from the shield of a pile of luggage and advance to the pier head. No second glance was needed to identify Mr. Hobbs, and until the perspective dwarfed him indistinguishably, he was to be seen alternately waving Kirkwood ironic farewell and blowing violent kisses to Miss Calendar from the tips of his soiled fingers. So he had escaped arrest, At first by turns indignant, and relieved to realise that thereafter they were to move in scenes in which his hateful shadow would not form an essentially component part, subsequently Kirkwood fell a prey to prophetic terrors. It was not alone fear of retribution that had induced Hobbs to relinquish his persecution, or so Kirkwood became convinced. If the mate's calculation had allowed for them the least fraction of a chance to escape apprehension on the farthest shores of the Channel, nor fears nor threats would have prevented him from sailing with the fugitives. Far from having left danger behind them on the Continent, Kirkwood believed in his secret heart that they were but flying to encounter it beneath the smoky pall of London. End of chapter 16, part 2. Recording by Michele Eaton.
Chapter 17 of The Black Bag. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Tomcho. The Black Bag by Louis Joseph Vance. Chapter 17. Rogues and Vagabonds. A westering sun striking down through the drab exhalations of 10,000 sooty chimney pots tinted the atmosphere with the hue of copper. The glance that wandered purposelessly out through the carriage windows recoiled, repelled by the endless dreary vista of the Surrey side's unnumbered roofs, or, probing instantaneously the hopeless depths of some grim narrow thoroughfare fleetingly disclosed, as the evening boat train from Dover swung on toward Charing Cross, its trucks level with the eaves of Southwark's dwellings, was saddened by the thought that in all the world's squalor such as this should obtain and flourish unrelieved. For perhaps the 10th time in the course of the journey, Kirkwood withdrew his gaze from the window and turned to the girl, a question ready framed upon his lips. "Are you quite sure?" he began. And then, alive to the clear and penetrating perception in the brown eyes that smiled into his from under their level brows, he stammered and left the query uncompleted. Continuing to regard him steadily and smilingly, Dorothy shook her head in playful denial and protest. "Do you know," she commented, "that this is about the 5th repetition of that identical question within the last quarter hour?" "How do you know what I meant to say?" he demanded, staring. "I can see it in your eyes. Besides, you've talked and thought of nothing else since we left the boat. Won't you believe me, please, when I say there's absolutely not a soul in London to whom I could go and ask for shelter? I don't think it's very nice of you to be so openly anxious to get rid of me." This latter was so essentially undeserved and so artlessly insincere that he must needs of course treat it with all seriousness. "That isn't fair, Miss Calendar. Really it's not." "What am I to think? I've told you any number of times that it's only an hour's ride on to Chiltern, where the Pierfords will be glad to take me in. You may depend upon it, by 8 to-night, at the latest, you'll have me off your hands, the drag and worry that I've been ever since." "Don't!" he pleaded vehemently. "Please! You know it isn't that. I don't want you off my hands, ever. That is to say, Here he was smitten with a dumbness, and sat, aghast at the enormity of his blunder, entreating her forgiveness with eyes that, very likely, pleaded his cause more eloquently than he guessed. "I mean," he floundered on presently, in the fatuous belief that he would this time be able to control both mind and tongue, "what I mean is, I'd be glad to go on serving you in any way I might, to the end of time, if you'd give me—" He left the declaration inconclusive, a stroke of diplomacy that would have graced an infinitely more adept wooer, but he used it all unconsciously. "Oh, Lord," he groaned in spirit, "worse and more of it. Why in thunder can't I say the right thing, right?" Egotistically absorbed by the problem thus formulated, he was heedless of her failure to respond, and remained pensively preoccupied until roused by the grinding and jolting of the train as it slowed to a halt preparatory to crossing the bridge. Then he sought to read his answer in the eyes of Dorothy, but she was looking away, staring thoughtfully out over the billowing sea of roofs that merged elusively into the haze long ere it reached the horizon, and Kirkwood could see the pulsing of the warm blood in her throat and cheeks, and the glamorous light that leaped and waned in her eyes as the ruddy evening sunlight warmed them was something any man might be glad to live for and die for. And he saw that she had understood, had grasped the thread of meaning that ran through the clumsy fabric of his halting speech and his sudden silences. She had understood without resentment. While, incredulous, he wrestled with the wonder of this fond discovery, she grew conscious of his gaze, and turned her head to meet it with one fearless and sweet, if troubled. "Dear Mr. Kirkwood," she said gently, bending forward as if to read between the lines anxiety had graven on his countenance, "won't you tell me, please, what it can be that so worries you? Is it possible that you still have a fear of my father? But don't you know that he can do nothing now that we're safe? We have only to take a cab to Paddington Station, and then—" "You mustn't underestimate the resource and ability of Mr. Calendar," he told her gloomily. "We've got a chance, no more. It wasn't—" He shut his teeth on his unruly tongue. Too late. Woman quick, she caught him up. "It wasn't that? Then what was it that worried you? If it's something that affects me, is it kind and right of you not to tell me?" "It affects us both," he conceded drearily. I don't—" The wretched embarrassment of the confession befogged his wits. He felt unable to frame the words. He appealed speechlessly for tolerance, with a face utterly woebegone and eyes piteous. The train began to move slowly across the Thames to Charing Cross. Mercilessly the girl persisted. "We've only a minute more. Surely you can trust me—" In exasperation he interrupted almost rudely. "It's only this. I'm strapped." "Strapped?" She knitted her brows over this fresh specimen of American slang. "Flat strapped, busted, broke, on my uppers, down and out." He reeled off synonyms without a smile. "I haven't enough money to pay cab fare across the town." "Oh!" she interpolated, enlightened. "To say nothing of taking us to Chiltern. I couldn't buy you a glass of water if you were thirsty. There isn't a soul on earth, within hail, who would trust me with a quarter, I mean a shilling, across London Bridge. I'm the original luckless wonder, and the only genuine Jonah extant." With a face the hue of fire, he cocked his eyebrows askew and attempted to laugh unconcernedly, to hide his bitter shame. "I've led you out of the frying pan into the fire, and I don't know what to do. Please call me names." And in a single instant all that he had consistently tried to avoid doing had been irretrievably done. If, with dawning comprehension, dismay flickered in her eyes, such dismay as such a confession can rouse only in one who, like Dorothy Calendar, has never known the want of a penny, it was swiftly driven out to make place for the truest and most gracious and unselfish solicitude. "Oh, poor Mr. Kirkwood! And it's all because of me. You've beggared yourself." "Not precisely. I was beggared to begin with." He hastened to disclaim her extravagant generosity of which she accused him. "I had only £3 or £4 to my name that night we met. I haven't told you. You've told me nothing whatever about yourself," she said reproachfully. "I didn't want to bother you with my troubles. I tried not to talk about myself. You knew I was an American, but I'm worse than that. I'm a Californian, from San Francisco." He tried unsuccessfully to make light of it. "I told you I was the luckless wonder. If I'd ever had any luck I would have stored a little money away. As it was, I lived on my income, left my principal in 'Frisco, and when the earthquake came it wiped me out completely." "And you were going home that night we made you miss your steamer." "It was my own fault, and I'm glad this blessed minute that I did miss it. Nice sort I'd have been to go off and leave you at the mercy—" Please, I want to think. I'm trying to remember how much you've gone through." "Precisely what I don't want you to do. Anyway, I did nothing more than any other fellow would have. Please don't give me credit that I don't deserve." But she was not listening, and a pause fell, while the train crawled warily over the trestle, as if in fear of the foul, muddy flood below. "And there's no way I can repay you." "There's nothing to be repaid," he contended stoutly. She clasped her hands and let them fall gently in her lap. "I've not a farthing in the world. I never dreamed. I'm so sorry, Mr. Kirkwood, terribly, terribly sorry. But what can we do? I can't consent to be a burden. But you're not. You're the one thing that—" He swerved sharply at an abrupt tangent. "There's one thing we can do, of course." She looked up inquiringly. "Craven Street is just round the corner." "Yes?" wonderingly. "I mean, we must go to Mrs. Hallam's house first off. It's too late now, after 5, else we could deposit the jewels in some bank. Since they are no longer yours, the only thing, and the proper thing to do, is to place them in safety or in the hands of their owner. If you take them directly to young Hallam, your hands will be clear, and I never did such a thing in my life, Miss Calendar, but if he's got a spark of gratitude in his make-up, I ought to be able to borrow £1 or so of him." "Do you think so?" She shook her head in doubt. "I don't know. I know so little of such things. You are right. We must take him the jewels. But—" Her voice trailed off into a sigh of profound perturbation. He dared not meet her look. Beneath his wandering gaze a country council steamboat darted swiftly down the stream from Charing Cross Pier in the shadow of the railway bridge. It seemed curious to reflect that from that very floating pier he had started first upon his quest of the girl beside him, only, if he had to count, 3 nights ago. 3 days and 3 nights. Altogether incredible seemed the transformation they had wrought in the complexion of the world. Yet nothing material was changed. He lifted his eyes. Beyond the river rose the embankment, crawling with traffic, backed by the green of the gardens and the shimmering walls of glass and stone of the great hotels, their windows glowing weirdly golden in the late sunlight. A little downstream Cleopatra's Needle rose, sadly the worse for London smoke, flanked by its couchant sphinxes, wearing a nimbus of circling, sweeping, swooping, wheeling gulls. Farther down, from the foot of that magnificent pile, Somerset House, Waterloo Bridge sprang over stream in its graceful arch. All as of yesterday, yet all changed. Why? Because a woman had entered into his life, because he had learned the lesson of love and had looked into the bright face of romance. With a jar the train started and began to move more swiftly. Kirkwood lifted the traveling bag to his knees. "Don't forget," he said with some difficulty, "you're to stick by me whatever happens. You mustn't desert me." "You know," the girl reproved him. "I know, but there must be no misunderstanding. Don't worry, we'll win out yet. I've a plan." Splendide mendax, he had not the glimmering of a plan. The engine panting, the train drew in beneath the vast sounding dome of the station to an accompaniment of dull thunderings, and stopped finally. Kirkwood got out, not without a qualm of regret at leaving the compartment. Therein, at least, they had some title to consideration, by virtue of their tickets. Now they were utterly vagabondish, penniless adventurers. The girl joined him. Slowly, elbow to elbow, the treasure bag between them, they made their way down toward the gates, atoms in the tide rip of humanity. 2 streams of passengers meeting on the narrow strip of platform, the one making for the streets, the other for the suburbs. Hurried and jostled, the girl clinging tightly to his arm lest they be separated in the crush, they came to the ticket wicket. Beyond the barrier surged a sea of hats, shining toppers, dignified and upstanding, the outward and visible manifestation of the sturdy, stodgy British spirit of respectability. Bowlers, round and sleek and humble, shapeless caps with cloth visors, manufactured of outrageous plaids, flower-like miracles of millinery from Bond Street, strangely plumed monstrosities from Petticoat Lane and Mile End Road. Beneath any one of these might lurk the maleficent brain, the spying eyes of Calendar, or one of his creatures. Beneath all of them that he encountered, Kirkwood peered in fearful inquiry. Yet, when they had passed unhindered the ordeal of the wickets, had run the gauntlet of those thousand eyes without lighting in any pair a spark of recognition, he began to bear himself with more assurance, to be sensible to a grateful glow of hope. Perhaps Hobbs's telegram had not reached its destination, for unquestionably the mate would have wired his chief. Perhaps some accident had befallen the conspirators. Perhaps the police had apprehended them. No matter how, one hoped against hope that they had been thrown off the trail. And indeed, it seemed as if they must have been misguided in some providential manner. On the other hand, it would be the crassest of indiscretions to linger about the place an instant longer than absolutely necessary. Outside the building, however, they paused perforce, undergoing the crossfire of the congregated cabbies, it being the first time that he had ever felt called upon to leave the station afoot. Kirkwood cast about irresolutely, seeking the sidewalk leading to the Strand. Abruptly he caught the girl by the arm and unceremoniously hurried her toward a waiting hansom. "Quick!" he begged her. "Jump right in, not an instant to spare." She nodded brightly, lips firm with courage, eyes shining. "My father?" "Yes." Kirkwood glanced back over his shoulder. "He hasn't seen us yet. They've just driven up. Stryker's with him. They're getting down." And to himself, "Oh, the devil!" cried the panic-stricken young man. He drew back to let the girl precede him into the cab. At the same time he kept an eye on Calendar, whose conveyance stood half the length of the station front away. The fat adventurer had finished paying off the driver, standing on the deck of the hansom. Stryker was already out, towering above the mass of people and glaring about him with his hawk-keen vision. Calendar had started to alight. His foot was leaving the step when Stryker's glance singled out their quarry. Instantly he turned and spoke to his confederate. Calendar wheeled like a flash, peering eagerly in the direction indicated by the captain's index finger. Then, snapping instructions to his driver, threw himself heavily back on the seat. Stryker, awkward on his land legs, stumbled and fell in an ill-calculated attempt to hoist himself hastily back into the vehicle. To the delay thus occasioned alone Kirkwood and Dorothy owed a respite of freedom. Their hansom was already swinging down toward the great gates of the yard, the American standing to make the driver comprehend the necessity for using the utmost speed in reaching the Craven Street address. The man proved both intelligent and obliging. Kirkwood had barely time to drop down beside the girl ere the cab was swinging out into the Strand, to the peril of the toes belonging to a number of righteously indignant pedestrians. "Good boy!" commented Kirkwood cheerfully. "That's the greatest comfort of all London, the surprising intellectual strength the average cabby displays when you promise him a tip." "Great heavens!" he cried, reading the girl's dismayed expression. "A tip! I never thought—" His face lengthened dismally, his eyebrows worked awry. "Now we are in for it." Dorothy said nothing. He turned in the seat, twisting his neck to peep through the small rear window. "I don't see their cab," he announced. "But of course they're after us. However, Craven Street's just round the corner. If we get there first, I don't fancy Freddie Hallam will have a cordial reception for our pursuers. They must have been on watch at Cannon Street, and finding we were not coming in that way, of course they were expecting us because of Hobbs' wire, they took cab for Charing Cross. Lucky for us. Or is it lucky?" he added doubtfully to himself. The hansom whipped round the corner into Craven Street. Kirkwood sprang up, grasping the treasure bag, ready to jump the instant they pulled in toward Mrs. Hallam's dwelling. But as they drew near upon the address he drew back with an exclamation of amazement. The house was closed, showing a blank face to the street. blinds drawn close down in the windows, area gate padlocked, an estate agent's board projecting from above the doorway advertising the property "To be let, furnished." Kirkwood looked back, craning his neck round the side of the cab. At the moment another hansom was breaking through the rank of humanity on the Strand crossing. He saw one or two figures leap desperately from beneath the horses' hoofs. Then the cab shot out swiftly down the street. The American stood up again, catching the cabby's eye. "Drive on!" he cried excitedly. "Don't stop! Drive as fast as you dare!" "Where to, sir?" "See that cab behind? Don't let it catch us. Shake it off, lose it somehow, but for the love of heaven don't let it catch us. I'll make it worth your while. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." The driver looked briefly over his shoulder and lifted his whip. "Don't worry, sir," he cried, entering into the spirit of the game with gratifying zest. "Shan't let 'em over'aul you, sir. Mind your 'ead." And as Kirkwood ducked, the whiplash shot out over the roof with a crack like the report of a pistol. Startled, the horse leaped indignantly forward. Momentarily the cab seemed to leave the ground, then settled down to a pace that carried them round the Avenue Theatre and across Northumberland Avenue into Whitehall Place, apparently on a single wheel. A glance behind showed Kirkwood that already they had gained, the pursuing hansom having lost ground through greater caution in crossing the main travelled thoroughfare. "Good little horse!" he applauded. A moment later he was endorsing without reserve the generalship of their cabby. The quick westward turn that took them into Whitehall, over across from the Horse Guards, likewise placed them in a pocket of traffic. A practically impregnable press of vehicles closed in behind them ere Calendar's conveyance could follow out of the side street. That the same conditions, but slightly modified, hemmed them in ahead, went for nothing in Kirkwood's estimation. "Good driver!" he approved heartily. "He's got a head on his shoulders." The girl found her voice. "How," she demanded in a breath, face blank with consternation, "how did you dare?" "Dare?" he echoed exultantly, and in his veins excitement was running like liquid fire. "Why shouldn't I dare for you, Dorothy?" "What have you not?" she amended softly, adding with a shade of timidity, "Philip." The long lashes swept up from her cheeks, like clouds revealing stars, unmasking eyes radiant and brave to meet his own. Then they fell, even as her lips drooped with disappointment, and she sighed. For he was not looking. Manlike, hot with the ardour of the chase, he was deaf and blind to all else. She saw that he had not even heard. Twice within the day she had forgotten herself, had overstepped the rigid bounds of her breeding in using his Christian name, and twice he had been oblivious to that token of their maturing understanding. So she sighed, and sighing, smiled again, resting an elbow on the window sill and flattening one small gloved hand against the frame for a brace against the jouncing of the hansom. It swept on with unabated speed, upstream beside the tawny reaches of the river, and for a time there was no speech between them, the while the girl lost consciousness of self and her most imminent peril, surrendering her being to the lingering sweetness of her long, dear thoughts. "I've got a scheme," Kirkwood declared so explosively that she caught her breath with the surprise of it. "There's the Pless, they know me there, and my credit's good. When we shake them off, we can have the cabby take us to the hotel. I'll register and borrow from the management enough to pay our way to Chiltern, and the tolls for a cable to New York. I've a friend or two over home who would have let me want for a few miserable pounds. So you see," he explained boyishly, "we're at the end of our troubles already." She said something inaudible, holding her face averted. He bent nearer to her, wondering. "I didn't understand," he suggested. Still looking from him. "I said you were very good to me," she said in a quavering whisper. "Dorothy," without his knowledge or intention before the fact, as instinctively as he made use of her given name, intimately, his strong fingers dropped and closed upon the little hand that lay beside him. "What is the matter, dear?" He leaned still further forward to peer into her face, till glance met glance in the ending, and his racing pulses tightened with sheer delight of the humid happiness in her glistening eyes. "Dorothy, child, don't worry so. No harm shall come to you. It's all working out. All working out right. Only have a little faith in me, and I'll make everything work out right, Dorothy." Gently she freed her fingers. "I wasn't," she told him in a voice that quivered between laughter and tears, "I wasn't worrying. I was you wouldn't understand. Don't be afraid I shall break down or anything." "I shan't," he reassured her. "I know you're not that sort. Besides, you'd have no excuse. We're moving along famously. That cabby knows his business." In fact, that gentleman was minute by minute demonstrating his peculiar fitness for the task he had so cheerfully undertaken. The superior horsemanship of the London hackney cabman needs no exploitation, and he, in whose hands rested the fate of the Calendar treasure, was peer of his compeers. He was instant to advantage himself of every opening to forward his pliant craft, quick to foresee the fortunes of the way and govern himself accordingly. Estimating with practised eye the precise moment when the police supervisor of traffic at the junction of Parliament and Bridge Streets would see fit to declare a temporary blockade, he so managed that his was the last vehicle to pass ere the official wand, to ignore which involves a forfeited license, was lifted, and indeed so close was his calculation that he escaped only with a scowl and word of warning from the bobby. A matter of no importance whatever, since his end was gained and the pursuing cab had been shut off by the blockade. In Calendar's driver, however, he had an adversary of abilities by no means to be despised. Precisely how the man contrived it is a question. That he made a detour by way of Derby Street is not improbable, unpleasant as it may have been for Stryker and Calendar to find themselves in such close proximity to "the Yard." At all events, he evaded the block, and hardly had the chase swung across Bridge Street than the pursuer was nimbly clattering in its wake. Past the Houses of Parliament, through Old Palace Yard, with the Abbey on their left, they swung away into Abington Street, whence suddenly they dived into the maze of back ways, great and mean, which lies to the south of Victoria. Doubling and twisting, now this way, now that, the driver tooled them through the intricate heart of this labyrinth, leading the pursuers a dance that Kirkwood thought calculated to dishearten and shake off the pursuit in the first 5 minutes. Yet always, peering back through the little peephole, he saw Calendar's cab pelting doggedly in their rear. 100 yards behind, no more, no less, hanging on with indomitable grit and determination. By degrees they drew westwards, threading Pimlico into Chelsea, once dashing briefly down the Grosvenor Road, the Thames a tawny flood beyond the river wall. Children cheered them on, and policemen turned to stare, doubting whether they should interfere. Minutes rolled into tens, measuring out an hour, and still they hammered on, hunted and hunters, playing their game of hare and hounds through the highways and byways of those staid and aged quarters. In the leading cab there were few words spoken. Kirkwood and Dorothy alike sat spellbound with the fascination of the game. If it is conceivable that the fox enjoys his part in the day's sport, then they were enjoying themselves. Now one spoke, now another, chiefly in the clipped phraseology of excitement, as "We're gaining," "Yes, think so," or "We'll tire them out," "Surely." "They can't catch us, can they, Philip?" "Never in the world." But he spoke with a confidence that he himself did not feel. For hope as he would, he could never see that the distance between the two had been materially lessened or increased. Their horses seemed almost evenly matched. The sun was very low behind the houses of the Surrey side when Kirkwood became aware that the horse was flagging, though, as comparison determined, no more so than the one behind. In grave concern the young man raised his hand, thrusting open the trap in the roof. Immediately the square of darkling sky was eclipsed by the cabby's face. Yes, sir? You had better drive as directly as you can to the Hotel Pless, Kirkwood called up. I'm afraid it's no use pushing your horse like this. I'm sure of it, sir. 'E's a good 'oss, 'e is, but 'e can't keep goin' for hever. You know, sir?" "I know. You've done very well. You've done your best." "Very good, sir. The Pless you said, sir?" "Right." The trap closed. 2 blocks farther, and their pace had so sensibly moderated that Kirkwood was genuinely alarmed. The pursuing cabby was lashing his animal without mercy, while "It aren't no use my whippin' 'im, sir," dropped through the trap. "He's doin' orl 'e can." "I understand." Despondent recklessness tightened Kirkwood's lips, and kindled an unpleasant light in his eyes. He touched his side pocket. Calendar's revolver was there. Dorothy should win away clear if he swung for it. He bent forward with the traveling bag in his hands. "What are you going to do?" The girl's voice was very tremulous. "Stand a chance, take a losing hazard. Can you run? You're not too tired?" "I can run. Perhaps not far, a little way at least." "And will you do as I say?" Her eyes met his, unwavering, bespeaking her implicit faith. "Promise." "I promise." "We'll have to drop off in a minute. The horse won't last. They're in the same box. Well, I undertake to stand 'em off for a bit. You take the bag and run for it. Just as soon as I can convince them, I'll follow. But if there's any delay, you call the first cab you see and drive to the Pless. I'll join you there." He stood up, surveying the neighborhood. Behind him the girl lifted her voice in protest. "No, Philip, no!" "You've promised," he said sternly, eyes ranging the street. "I don't care. I won't leave you." He shook his head in silent contradiction, frowning, but not frowning because of the girl's mutiny. He was a little puzzled by a vague impression, and was striving to pin it down for recognition, but was so thoroughly bemused with fatigue and despair that only with great difficulty could he force his faculties to logical reasoning, his memory to respond to his call upon it. The hansom was traversing a street in Old Brompton, a quaint, prim byway lined with dwellings singularly old worldish, even for London. He seemed to know it subjectively, to have retained a memory of it from another existence, as the stage setting of a vivid dream, all forgotten, will sometimes recur with peculiar and exasperating intensity in broad daylight. The houses, with their sloping, red-tiled roofs, unexpected gables, spontaneous dormer windows, glass panes set in leaded frames, red brick façades trimmed with green shutters, and doorsteps of white stone, each sitting back, sedate and self-sufficient, in its trim dooryard fenced off from the public thoroughfare, all wore an aspect hauntingly familiar, and yet strange. A corner sign, remarked in passing, had named the spot Aspen Villas. Though he felt he knew the sound of those syllables as well as he did the name of the Pless, strive as he might, he failed to make them convey anything tangible to his intelligence. When had he heard of it? At what time had his errant footsteps taken him through this curious survival of 18th century London? Not that it mattered when. It could have no possible bearing on the emergency. He really gave it little thought. The mental processes recounted were mostly subconscious, if none the less real. His objective attention was wholly preoccupied with the knowledge that Calendar's cab was drawing perilously near, and he was debating whether or not they should alight at once and try to make a better pace afoot, when the decision was taken wholly out of his hands. Blindly staggering on, wilted with weariness, the horse stumbled in the shafts and plunged forward on its knees. Quick as the driver was to pull it up, with a cruel jerk of the bits, Kirkwood was caught unprepared. Lurching against the dashboard, he lost his footing, grasped frantically at the unstable air, and went over, bringing up in a sitting position in the gutter, with a solid shock that jarred his very teeth. For a moment, dazed as he sat there blinking, by the time he got to his feet, the girl stood beside him, questioning him with keen solicitude. "No," he gasped, "not hurt. Only surprised. Wait." Their cab had come to a complete standstill. Calendar's was no more than 20 yards behind, and as Kirkwood caught sight of him the fat adventurer was in the act of lifting himself ponderously out of the seat. Incontinently the young man turned to the girl and forced the traveling bag into her hands. "Run for it!" he begged her. "Don't stop to argue. You promised. Run! I'll come." "Philip!" she pleaded. "Dorothy!" he cried in torment. Perhaps it was his unquestionable distress that weakened her. Suddenly she yielded, with whatever reason. He was only hazily aware of the swish of her skirts behind him. He had no time to look round and see that she got away safely. He had only eyes and thoughts for Calendar and Stryker. They were both afoot now and running toward him, the one as awkward as the other, but neither yielding a jot of their malignant purpose. He held the picture of it oddly graphic in his memory for many a day thereafter. Calendar making directly for him, his heavy-featured face a dull red with the exertion, his fat head dropped forward as if too heavy for his neck of a bull, his small eyes bright with anger. Stryker, shying off at a discreet angle, evidently with the intention of devoting himself to the capture of the girl, the two cabs with their dejected screws at rest in the middle of the quiet, twilit street. He seemed even to see himself, standing stockily prepared, hands in his coat pockets, his own head inclined with a suggestion of pugnacity. To this mental photograph another succeeds, of the same scene an instant later, all as it had been before, their relative positions unchanged, save that Stryker and Calendar had come to a dead stop, and that Kirkwood's right arm was lifted and extended, pointing at the captain. So forgetful of self was he that it required a moment's thought to convince him that he was really responsible for the abrupt transformation. Incredulously he realized that he had drawn Calendar's revolver and pulled Stryker up short, in mid-stride, by the mute menace of it, as much as by the hoarse cry of warning. "Stryker, not another foot!" With this there chimed in Dorothy's voice, ringing bell-clear from a little distance, "Philip!" Like a flash he wheeled, to add yet another picture to his mental gallery. Perhaps 20 feet up the sidewalk a gate stood open. Just outside it a man of tall and slender figure, rigged out in a bizarre costume consisting mainly of a flowered dressing gown and slippers, was waiting in an attitude of singular impassivity. Within it, pausing with a foot lifted to the doorstep, bag in hand, her head turned as she looked back, was Dorothy. As he comprehended these essential details of the composition, the man in the flowered dressing gown raised a hand, beckoning to him in a manner as imperative as his accompanying words. "Kirkwood!" he saluted the young man in a clear and vibrant voice. "Put up that revolver and stop this foolishness." And, with a jerk of his head towards the doorway in which Dorothy now waited, hesitant, "Come, sir, quickly!" Kirkwood choked on a laugh that was half a sob. "Brentwick!" he cried, restoring the weapon to his pocket and running toward his friend. "Of all happy accidents!" "You may call it that," retorted the elder man, with a fleeting smile as Kirkwood slipped inside the dooryard. "Come," he said, "let's get into the house." "But you said I thought you went to Munich," stammered Kirkwood, and so thoroughly impregnated was his mind with this understanding that it was hard for him to adjust his perceptions of the truth. "I was detained by business," responded Brentwick briefly. His gaze, weary and wistful behind his glasses, rested on the face of the girl on the threshold of his home, and the faint, sensitive flush of her face deepened. He stopped and honored her with a bow that, for all his fantastical attire, would have graced a beau of an earlier decade. "Will you be pleased to enter?" he suggested punctiliously. "My house, such as it is quite at your disposal. And," he added, with a glance over his shoulder, "I fancy that a word or two may presently be passed which you would hardly care to hear." Dorothy's hesitation was but transitory. Kirkwood was reassuring her with a smile more like his wonted boyish grin than anything he had succeeded in conjuring up throughout the day. Her own smile answered it, and with a murmured word of gratitude, and a little, half timid, half distant bow for Brentwick, she passed on into the hallway. Kirkwood lingered with his friend upon the door stoop. Calendar, recovered from his temporary consternation, was already at the gate, bending over it, fat fingers fumbling with the latch, his round red face, lifted to the house, darkly working with chagrin. From his threshold, watching him with a slight contraction of the eyes, Brentwick hailed him in tones of cloying courtesy. "Do you wish to see me, sir?" The fat adventurer faltered just within the gateway. Then, with a truculent swagger, "I want my daughter," he declared vociferously. Brentwick peered mildly over his glasses, first at Calendar, then at Kirkwood. His glance lingered a moment on the young man's honest eyes, and swung back to Calendar. "My good man," he said with sublime tolerance, "will you be pleased to take yourself off, to the devil if you like, or shall I take the trouble to interest the police?" He removed one fine and fragile hand from a pocket of the flowered dressing gown, long enough to jerk it significantly toward the nearest street corner. Thunderstruck, Calendar glanced hastily in the indicated direction. A blue-coated bobby was to be seen approaching with measured stride, diffusing upon the still evening air an impression of ineffably capable self-contentment. Calendar's fleshy lips parted and closed without a sound. They quivered. Beneath them quivered his assortment of graduated chins. His heavy and pendulous cheeks quivered, slowly empurpling with the dark tide of his apoplectic wrath. The close-clipped thatch of his iron-gray mustache, even, seemed to bristle like hairs upon the neck of a maddened dog. Beneath him his fat legs trembled, and indeed his whole huge carcass shook visibly, in the stress of his restrained wrath. Suddenly, overwhelmed, he banged the gate behind him and waddled off to join the captain, who already, with praiseworthy native prudence, had fallen back upon their cab. From his coign of strategic advantage, the comfortable elevation of his box, Kirkwood's cabby, whose huge enjoyment of the adventurer's discomfiture had throughout been noisily demonstrative, entreated Calendar with lifted forefingers, bland affability, and expressions of heartfelt sympathy. "Keb, sir? 'Ave a keb, sir. Do! Try a ride be'ind a real 'orse, sir. Don't you go on wastin' time on 'im." A jerk of a derisive thumb singled out the other cabman. "'E aren't plyin' you fair, sir. I knows 'im. 'E's a artful guy deceiver, 'e is. Look at 'is 'orse, which it aren't. It's a style, that's wot it is. Tyke a father's hadvice, sir, and next time your fairest darter runs awye with the Dook in disguise, chyse 'im in a real keb, sir, not a cheap imitation. Keb, sir? Garn, you 'ard-'earted." Here he swooped upwards in a dizzy flight of vituperation best unrecorded. Calendar, beyond an absent-minded flirt of one hand behind his ear, as who should shoo away a buzzing insect, ignored him utterly. Sullenly extracting money from his pocket, he paid off his driver, and in company with Stryker, trudged in morose silence down the street. Brentwick touched Kirkwood's arm and drew him into the house. End of Chapter 17. Recording by William Tomcho. Chapter 18 of The Black Bag. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Tomcho. The Black Bag by Louis Joseph Vance. Chapter 18. Adventure's Luck. As the door closed, Kirkwood swung impulsively to Brentwick, with the brief uneven laugh of fine-drawn nerves. "Good God, sir!" he cried. "You don't know—" "I can surmise," interrupted the elder man shrewdly. "You turned up in the nick of time, for all the world like Harlequin popping through a stage trap? No, an incarnation of the Providence that watches over children and fools." Brentwick dropped a calming hand upon his shoulder. "Your simile seems singularly happy, Philip. Permit me to suggest that you join the child in my study." He laughed quietly, with a slight nod toward an open door at the end of the hallway. "For yourself, I'll be with you in one moment." A faint, indulgent smile lurking in the shadow of his white mustache, he watched the young man wheel and dart through the doorway. "Young hearts!" he commended inaudibly, and a trace sadly. "Youth!" Beyond the threshold of the study, Kirkwood paused, eager eyes searching its somber shadows for a sign of Dorothy. A long room and deep, it was lighted only by the circumscribed disk of illumination thrown on the central desk by a shaded reading lamp, and the flickering glow of a grate fire set beneath the mantel of a side wall. At the back, heavy velvet portières cloaked the recesses of two long windows, closed jealously even against the twilight. Aside from the windows, doors, and chimney piece, every foot of wall space was occupied by towering bookcases or by shelves crowded to the limit of their capacity with an amazing miscellany of objects of art, the fruit of years of patient and discriminating collecting. An exotic and heady atmosphere, compounded of the faint and intangible exhalations of these insentient things, fragrance of sandalwood, myrrh, and musk, reminiscent whiffs of half-forgotten incense, seemed to intensify the impression of gloomy richness and repose. By the fireplace, a little to one side, stood Dorothy, one small foot resting on the brass fender, her figure merging into the dusky background, her delicate beauty gaining an effect of elusive and ethereal mystery in the waning and waxing ruddy glow upflung from the bedded coals. "Oh, Philip!" She turned swiftly to Kirkwood with extended hands and a low broken cry. "I'm so glad!" A trace of hysteria in her manner warned him, and he checked himself upon the verge of a too dangerous tenderness. "There!" he said soothingly, letting her hands rest gently in his palms while he led her to a chair. "We can make ourselves easy now." She sat down, and he released her hands with a reluctance less evident than actual. "If ever I say another word against my luck—" "Who?" inquired the girl, lowering her voice. "Who is the gentleman in the flower dressing gown?" "Brentwick. George Sylvester Brentwick. An old friend. I've known him for years, ever since I came abroad. Curiously enough, however, this is the first time I've ever been here. I called once, but he wasn't in, a few days ago, the day we met. I thought the place looked familiar. Stupid of me." "Philip," said the girl, with a grave face but a shaking voice. "It was." She laughed provokingly. "It was so funny, Philip. I don't know why I ran, when you told me to, but I did, and while I ran, I was conscious of the front door, here, opening, and this tall man in the flower dressing gown coming down to the gate as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world for him to stroll out, dressed that way, in the evening. And he opened the gate and bowed, and said, ever so pleasantly, 'Won't you come in, Miss Calendar?'" "He did!" exclaimed Kirkwood. "But how—" "How can I say?" she expostulated. "At all events, he seemed to know me, and when he added something about calling you in too, he said Mr. Kirkwood, I didn't hesitate." "It's strange enough, surely, and fortunate. Bless his heart!" said Kirkwood. "And hum," said Mr. Brentwick considerately, entering the study. He had discarded the dressing gown and was now in evening dress. The girl rose. Kirkwood turned. "Mr. Brentwick," he began. But Brentwick begged his patience with an eloquent gesture. "Sir," he said, somewhat austerely, "permit me to put a single question. Have you by any chance paid your cabby?" "Why," faltered the younger man, with a flaming face, "why, no. That is—" The other quietly put his hand upon a bell pull. A faint jingling sound was at once audible, emanating from the basement. How much should you say you owe him?" "I I haven't a penny in the world." The shrewd eyes flashed their amusement into Kirkwood's. "Tut, tut!" Brentwick chuckled. "Between gentlemen, my dear boy, dear me, you are slow to learn." "I'll never be contented to sponge on my friends," explained Kirkwood in deepest misery. "I can't tell when—" "Tut, tut! How much did you say?" "10 shillings, or say 12, would be about right," stammered the American, swayed by conflicting emotions of gratitude and profound embarrassment. A soft-footed butler, impassive as fate, materialized mysteriously in the doorway. "You rang, sir?" he interrupted frigidly. "I rang, Wotton." His master selected a sovereign from his purse and handed it to the servant. "For the cabby, Wotton." "Yes, sir." The butler swung automatically on one heel. "And Wotton." "Sir?" "If anyone should ask for me, I'm not at home." "Very good, sir." "And if you should see a pair of disreputable scoundrels skulking in the neighborhood, one short and stout, the other tall and evidently a seafaring man, let me know." "Thank you, sir." A moment later the front door was heard to close. Brentwick turned with a little bow to the girl. "My dear Miss Calendar," he said, rubbing his thin, fine hands, "I am old enough, I trust, to call you such without offence. Please be seated." Complying, the girl rewarded him with a radiant smile. Whereupon, striding to the fireplace, their host turned his back to it, clasped his hands behind him, and glowered benignly upon the two. "Ah!" he observed in accents of extreme personal satisfaction. "Romance, romance!" "Would you mind telling us how you knew—" began Kirkwood anxiously. "Not in the least, my dear Philip. It is simple enough. I possess an imagination. From my bedroom window, on the floor above, I happened to behold two cabs racing down the street, the one doggedly pursuing the other. The foremost stops, perforce of a fagged horse. There alights a young gentleman looking, if you'll pardon me, uncommonly seedy. He is followed by a young lady, if she will pardon me," with another little bow, "uncommonly pretty. With these two old eyes I observe that the gentleman does not pay his cabby. Ergo, I intelligently deduce, he is short of money. Eh?" "You were right," affirmed Kirkwood, with a rueful and crooked smile. "But—" "So, so," pursued Brentwick, rising on his toes and dropping back again, "so this world of ours wags on to the old, old tune. And I, who in my younger days pursued adventure without success, in dotage find myself dragged into a romance by my two ears, whether I will or no, eh? And now you are going to tell me all about it, Philip. There is a chair. Well, Wotton?" The butler had again appeared noiselessly in the doorway. "Beg pardon, sir, they're waiting, sir." "The caitiffs, Wotton?" "Yes, sir." "Where waiting?" "One at each end of the street, sir." "Thank you. You may bring a sherry and biscuit, Wotton." "Thank you, sir." The servant vanished. Brentwick removed his glasses, rubbed them, and blinked thoughtfully at the girl. "My dear," he said suddenly, with a peculiar tremor in his voice, "you resemble your mother remarkably. Tut, I should know. Time was when I was one of her most ardent admirers." "You knew my mother?" cried Dorothy, profoundly moved. "Did I not know you at sight? My dear, you are your mother reincarnate, for the good of an unworthy world. She was a very beautiful woman, my dear." Wotton entered with a silver serving tray, offering it in turn to Dorothy, Kirkwood, and his employer. While he was present the three held silent, the girl trembling slightly but with her face aglow, Kirkwood half stupefied between his ease from care and his growing astonishment as Brentwick continued to reveal unexpected phases of his personality. Brentwick himself outwardly imperturbable and complacent, for all that his hand shook as he lifted his wine-glass. "You may go, Wotton. Or wait, don't you feel the need of a breath of fresh air, Wotton?" "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." "Then change your coat, Wotton, light your pipe, and stroll out for half an hour. You need not leave the street, but if either the tall thin blackguard with the seafaring habit, or the short stout rascal with the air of mystery should accost you, treat them with all courtesy, Wotton. You will be careful not to tell either of them anything in particular, although I don't mind your telling them that Mr. Brentwick lives here, if they ask. I am mostly concerned to discover if they propose becoming fixtures on the street corners, Wotton." "Quite so, sir." "Now you may go, Wotton," continued his employer as the butler took himself off as softly as a cat. "Grows daily a more valuable mechanism. He is by no means human in any respect, but I find him extremely handy to have round the house. And now, my dear," turning to Dorothy, "with your permission, I desire to drink to the memory of your beautiful mother and to the happiness of her beautiful daughter." "But you will tell me—" "A number of interesting things, Miss Calendar, if you'll be good enough to let me choose the time. I beg you to be patient with the idiosyncrasies of an old man, who means no harm, who has a reputation as an eccentric to sustain before his servants. And now," said Brentwick, setting aside his glass, "now, my dear boy, for the adventure." Kirkwood chuckled, infected by his host's genial humor. "How do you know—" "How can it be otherwise?" countered Brentwick, with a trace of asperity. "Am I to be denied my adventure? Sir, I refuse without equivocation. Your very bearing breathes of romance. There must be an adventure forthcoming, Philip. Otherwise my disappointment will be so acute that I shall be regretfully obliged seriously to consider my right, as a householder, to show you the door." "But, Mr. Brentwick—" "Sit down, sir," commanded Brentwick, with such a peremptory note that the young man, who had risen, obeyed out of sheer surprise. Upon which his host advanced, indicting him with a long white forefinger. "Would you, sir," he demanded, "again expose this little lady to the machinations of that corpulent scoundrel whom I have just had the pleasure of shooing off my premises because you choose to resent an old man's raillery?" "I apologize," Kirkwood humored him. "I accept the apology in the spirit in which it is offered. I repeat. Now for the adventure, Philip. If the story's long, epitomize. We can consider details more at our leisure." Kirkwood's eyes consulted the girl's face. Almost imperceptibly she nodded him permission to proceed. "Briefly, then," he began haltingly, "the man who followed us to the door here is Miss Calendar's father." "Oh? His name, please." "George Burgoyne Calendar." "Ah, an American. I remember now. Continue, please." "He is hounding us, sir, with the intention of stealing some property which he caused to be stolen, which we, to put it bluntly, stole from him, to which he has no shadow of a title, and which, finally, we're endeavoring to return to its owners." "My dear," interpolated Brentwick gently, looking down at the girl's flushed face and drooping head. "He ran us to the last ditch," Kirkwood continued. "I've spent my last farthing trying to lose him." "But why have you not caused his arrest?" Brentwick inquired. Kirkwood nodded meaningly toward the girl. Brentwick made a sound indicating comprehension, a click of the tongue behind closed teeth. "We came to your door by the merest accident. It might as well have been another. I understood you were in Munich, and it never entered my head that we'd find you home." "A communication from my solicitors detained me," explained Brentwick. "And now, what do you intend to do?" "Trespass as far on your kindness as you'll permit. In the first place, I want the use of a few pounds with which to cable some friends in New York, for money, on receipt of which I can repay you." "Philip," observed Brentwood, "you are a most irritating child. But I forgive you the faults of youth. You may proceed, bearing in mind, if you please, that I am your friend equally with any you may own in America." "You're one of the best men in the world," said Kirkwood. "Tut, tut! Will you get on?" "Secondly, I want you to help us to escape Calendar to night. It is necessary that Miss Calendar should go to Chiltern this evening, where she has friends who will receive and protect her." "H'm," grumbled their host, meditative. "My faith!" he commented, with brightening eyes. "It sounds almost too good to be true, and I've been growing afraid that the world was getting to be a most humdrum and uninteresting planet. Miss Calendar, I am a widower of so many years' standing that I had almost forgotten I had ever been anything but a bachelor. I fear my house contains little that will be of service to a young lady. Yet a room is at your disposal. The parlour maid will show you the way. And Philip, between you and me, I venture to remark that hot water and cold steel would add to the attractiveness of your personal appearance. My valet will attend you in my room. Dinner," concluded Brentwick with anticipative relish, "will be served in precisely 30 minutes. I shall expect you to entertain me with a full and itemized account of every phase of your astonishing adventure. Later we will find a way to Chiltern." Again he put a hand upon the bell pull. Simultaneously Dorothy and Kirkwood rose. "Mr. Brentwick," said the girl, her eyes starred with tears of gratitude, I really don't know how—" "My dear," said the old gentleman, "you will thank me most appropriately by continuing, to the best of your ability, to resemble your mother more remarkably every minute." "But I—" began Kirkwood. "You, my dear Philip, can thank me best by permitting me to enjoy myself, which I am doing thoroughly at the present moment. My pleasure in being invited to interfere in your young affairs is more keen than you can well surmise. Moreover," said Mr. Brentwick, "so long have I been an amateur adventurer that I esteem it the rarest privilege to find myself thus on the point of graduating into professional ranks." He rubbed his hands, beaming upon them. "And," he added, as a maid appeared at the door, "I have already schemed me a scheme for the discomfiture of our friends the enemy, a scheme which we will discuss with our dinner, while the heathen rage and imagine a vain thing in the outer darkness." Kirkwood would have lingered, but of such inflexible temper was his host that he bowed him into the hands of a man servant without permitting him another word. "Not a syllable," he insisted. "I protest I am devoured with curiosity, my dear boy, but I have also bowels of compassion. When we are well on with our meal, when you are strengthened with food and drink, then you may begin. But now, Dickie," to the valet, "do your duty." Kirkwood, laughing with exasperation, retired at discretion, leaving Brentwick the master of the situation, a charming gentleman with a will of his own and a way that went with it. He heard the young man's footsteps diminish on the stairway, and again he smiled the indulgent, melancholy smile of mellow years. "Youth," he whispered softly, "romance. And now," with a brisk change of tone as he closed the study door, "now we are ready for this interesting Mr. Calendar." Sitting down at his desk, he found and consulted a telephone directory, but its leaves, at first rustling briskly at the touch of the slender and delicate fingers, were presently permitted to lie unturned, the book resting open on his knees the while he stared wistfully into the fire. A suspicion of moisture glimmered in his eyes. "Dorothy," he whispered huskily. And a little later, rising, he proceeded to the telephone. An hour and a half later, Kirkwood, his self-respect something restored by a bath, a shave, and a resumption of clothes which had been hastily but thoroughly cleansed and pressed by Brentwick's valet, his confidence and courage mounting high under the combined influence of generous wine, substantial food, the presence of his heart's mistress, and the admiration, which was unconcealed, of his friend, concluded at the dinner table his narration. "And that," he said, looking up from his savoury, "is about all." "Bravo!" applauded Brentwick, eyes shining with delight. "All," interposed Dorothy in warm reproach. "But what he hasn't told, which, my dear, is to be accounted for wholly by a very creditable modesty, rarely encountered in the young men of the present day. It was, of course, altogether different with those of my younger years." "Yes, Wotton?" Brentwick sat back in his chair, inclining an attentive ear to a communication murmured by the butler. Kirkwood's gaze met Dorothy's across the expanse of shining cloth. He deprecated her interruption with a whimsical twist of his eyebrows. "Really, you shouldn't," he assured her in an undertone. "I've done nothing to deserve—" But under the spell of her serious sweet eyes he fell silent, and presently looked down, strangely abashed, and contemplated the vast enormity of his unworthiness. Coffee was set before them by Wotton, the impassive, Brentwick refusing it with a little sigh. "It is one of the things, as Philip knows," he explained to the girl, "denied me by the physician who makes his life happy by making mine a waste. I am allowed but three luxuries: cigars, travel in moderation, and the privilege of imposing on my friends. The first I propose presently, to enjoy by your indulgence, and the second I shall this evening undertake by virtue of the third, of which I have just availed myself." Smiling at the involution, he rested his head against the back of his chair, eyes roving from the girl's face to Kirkwood's. "Inspiration to do which," he proceeded gravely, "came to me from the seafaring picaroon Stryker, did you name him? Via the excellent Wotton. While you were preparing for dinner, Wotton returned from his constitutional with the news that, leaving the corpulent person on watch at the corner, Captain Stryker had temporarily made himself scarce. However, we need feel no anxiety concerning his whereabouts, for he reappeared in good time and a motor car. From which it becomes evident that you have not overrated their pertinacity. The fiasco of the cab chase is not to be re-enacted." Resolutely the girl repressed a gasp of dismay. Kirkwood stared moodily into his cup. "These men bore me fearfully," he commented at last. "And so," continued Brentwick, "I bethought me of a counter-stroke. It is my good fortune to have a friend whose whim it is to support a touring car, chiefly in innocuous idleness. Accordingly, I have telephoned him and commandeered the use of this machine. Mechanician, too. Though not a betting man, I am willing to risk recklessly a few pence in support of my contention that of the two, Captain Stryker's car and ours, the latter will prove considerably the most speedy. In short, I suggest," he concluded, thoughtfully lacing his long white fingers, "that, avoiding the hazards of cab and railway carriage, we motor to Chiltern, the night being fine and the road, I am told, exceptionally good. Miss Dorothy, what do you think?" Instinctively the girl looked to Kirkwood, then shifted her glance to their host. "I think you are wonderful, thoughtful, and kind," she said simply. "And you, Philip?" "It's an inspiration," the younger man declared. "I can't think of anything better calculated to throw them off than to distance them by motor car. It would be always possible to trace our journey by rail." "Then," announced Brentwick, making as if to rise, "we had best go. If neither my hearing nor Captain Stryker's car deceives me, our fiery chariot is panting at the door." A little sobered from the confident spirit of quiet gaiety in which they had dined, they left the table. Not that, in their hearts, either greatly questioned their ultimate triumph, but they were allowing for the element of error so apt to set at naught human calculations. Calendar himself had already been proved fallible. Within the bounds of possibility, their turn to stumble might now be imminent. When he let himself dwell upon it, their utter helplessness to give Calendar pause by commonplace methods maddened Kirkwood. With another scoundrel it had been so simple a matter to put a period to his activities by a word to the police. But he was her father. For that reason he must continually be spared. Even though, in desperate extremity, she should give consent to the arrest of the adventurers, retaliation would follow, swift and sure. For they might not overlook nor gloze the fact that hers had been the hands responsible for the theft of the jewels. Innocent though she had been in committing that larceny, a cat's paw guided by an intelligence unscrupulous and malign, the law would not hold her guiltless were she once brought within its cognizance. Nor possibly would the Hallams, mother and son. Upon their knowledge and their fear of this, undoubtedly Calendar was reckoning. Witness the barefaced effrontery with which he operated against them. His fear of the police might be genuine enough, but he was never for an instant disturbed by any doubt lest his daughter should turn against him. She would never dare that. Before they left the house, while Dorothy was above stairs resuming her hat and coat, Kirkwood and Brentwick reconnoitered from the drawing-room windows, themselves screened from observation by the absence of light in the room behind. Before the door a motor car waited, engines humming impatiently, mechanician ready in his seat, an uncouth shape in goggles and leather garments that shone like oilskins under the street lights. At one corner another and a smaller car stood in waiting, its lamps like a baleful eyes glaring through the night. In the shadows across the way a lengthy shadow lurked, Stryker beyond reasonable question. Otherwise the street was deserted. Not even that adventitious bobby of the early evening was now in evidence. Dorothy presently joining them, Brentwick led the way to the door. Wotton, apparently nerveless beneath his absolute immobility, let them out, and slammed the door behind them with such promptitude as to give cause for the suspicion that he was a fraud, a sham, beneath his icy exterior desperately afraid lest the house be stormed by the adventurers. Kirkwood to the right, Brentwick to the left of Dorothy, the former carrying the treasure bag, they hastened down the walk and through the gate to the car. The watcher across the way was moved to whistle shrilly. The other car lunged forward nervously. Brentwick, taking the front seat beside the mechanician, left the tonneau to Kirkwood and Dorothy. As the American slammed the door, the car swept smoothly out into the middle of the way, while the pursuing car swerved in to the other curb, slowing down to let Stryker jump aboard. Kirkwood put himself in the seat by the girl's side, and for a few moments was occupied with the arrangement of the robes. Then, sitting back, he found her eyes fixed upon him, pools of inscrutable night in the shadow of her hat. "You aren't afraid, Dorothy?" She answered quietly, "I am with you, Philip." Beneath the robe their hands met. Exalted, excited, he turned and looked back. 100 yards to the rear, 4 unwinking eyes trailed them, like some modern Nemesis in monstrous guise. End of chapter 18. Recording by William Tomcho. Chapter 19, Part 1 of The Black Bag. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Tomcho. The Black Bag by Louis Joseph Vance. Chapter 19, Part 1, The Uxbridge Road. At a steady gait, now and again checked in deference to the street traffic, Brentwick's motor car rolled, with resonant humming of the engine, down the Cromwell Road, swerved into Warwick Road, and swung northward through Kensington to Shepherd's Bush. Behind it, Calendar's car clung as if towed by an invisible cable, never gaining, never losing, mutely testifying to the adventurers' unrelenting, grim determination to leave them no instant's freedom from surveillance, to keep forever at their shoulders, watching his chance, biding his time with sinister patience until the moment when, wearied, their vigilance should relax. To some extent he reckoned without his motor car. As long as they travelled within the metropolitan limits, constrained to observe a decorous pace in view of the prejudices of the county council, it was a matter of no difficulty whatever to maintain his distance. But once they had won through Shepherd's Bush and, paced by huge double-decked trolley trams, were flying through Hammersmith on the Uxbridge Road, once they had run through Acton and knew beyond dispute that now they were without the city boundaries, then the complexion of the business was suddenly changed. Not too soon for honest sport. Calendar was to have, Kirkwood would have said in lurid American idiom, a run for his money. The scattered lights of Southall were winking out behind them before Brentwick chose to give the word to the mechanician. Quietly the latter threw in the clutch for the third speed, and the fourth. The car leaped forward like a startled race horse. The motor lilted merrily into its deep-throated song of the open road, its contented, silken humming passing into a sonorous and sustained purr. Kirkwood and the girl were first jarred violently forward, then thrown together. She caught his arm to steady herself. It seemed the most natural thing imaginable that he should take her hand and pass it beneath his arm, holding her so, his fingers closed above her own. Before they had recovered, or had time to catch their breath, a mile of Middlesex had dropped to the rear. Not quite so far had they distanced Calendar's trailing nemesis of the four glaring eyes. The pursuers put forth a gallant effort to hold their place. At intervals during the first few minutes a heavy roaring and crashing could be heard behind them. Gradually it subsided, dying on the wings of the free rushing wind that buffeted their faces as mile after mile was reeled off and the wide, darkling English countryside opened out before them, sweet and wonderful. Once Kirkwood looked back. In the winking of an eye he saw four faded discs of light, pallid with despair, top a distant rise and glide down into darkness. When he turned, Dorothy was interrogating him with eyes whose melting, shadowed loveliness, revealed to him in the light of the far, still stars, seemed to incite him to that madness which he had bade himself resist with all his strength. He shook his head, as if to say, "They cannot catch us." His hour was not yet. Time enough to think of love and marriage, as if he were capable of consecutive thought on any other subject. Time enough to think of them when he had gone back to his place, or rather when he should have found it, in the ranks of breadwinners, and so have proved his right to mortal happiness. Time enough then to lay whatever he might have to offer at her feet. Now he could conceive of no baser treachery to his soul's desire than to advantage himself of her gratitude. Resolutely he turned his face forward, striving with all his will and might to forget the temptation of her lips, weary as they were and petulant with waiting, and so sat rigid in his time of trial, clinging with what strength he could to the standards of his honor, and trying to lose his dream in dreaming of the bitter struggle that seemed likely to be his future portion. Perhaps she guessed a little of the fortunes of the battle that was being waged within him. Perhaps not. Whatever the trend of her thoughts, she did not draw away from him. Perhaps the breath of night, fresh and clean and fragrant with the odor of the fields and hedges, sweeping into her face with velvety caress, rendered her drowsy. Presently the silken lashes drooped, fluttering upon her cheeks. The tired and happy smile hovered above her lips. In something less than half an hour of this wild driving, Kirkwood roused out of his reverie sufficiently to become sensible that the speed was slackening. Incoherent snatches of sentences, fragments of words and phrases spoken by Brentwick and the mechanician, were flung back past his ears by the rushing wind. Shielding his eyes, he could see dimly that the mechanician was tinkering, apparently, with the driving gear. Then, their pace continuing steadily to abate, he heard Brentwick fling at the man a sharp-toned and querulously impatient question. What was the trouble? His reply came in a single word, not distinguishable. The girl sat up, opening her eyes, disengaging her arm. Kirkwood bent forward and touched Brentwick on the shoulder. The latter turned to him, a face lined with deep concern. "Trouble," he announced superfluously. "I fear we have blundered." "What is it?" asked Dorothy in a troubled voice. "Petrol seems to be running low. Charles here," he referred to the mechanician, "says the tank must be leaking. We'll go on as best we can and try to find an inn. Fortunately, most of the inns nowadays keep supplies of petrol for just such emergencies." "Are we do you think "Oh, no, not a bit of danger of that," returned Brentwick hastily. "They'll not catch up with us this night. That is a very inferior car they have, so Charles says. At least, nothing to compare with this. If I'm not in error, there's the Crown and Mitre just ahead. We'll make it, fill our tanks, and be off again before they can make up half their loss." Dorothy looked anxiously to Kirkwood, her lips forming an unuttered query. What did he think? "Don't worry, we'll have no trouble," he assured her stoutly. "The chauffeur knows, undoubtedly." None the less, he was moved to stand up in the tonneau, conscious of the presence of the traveling bag snug between his feet, as well as the weight of Calendar's revolver in his pocket, while he stared back along the road. There was nothing to be seen of their persecutors. The car continued to crawl. 5 minutes dragged out tediously. Gradually they drew abreast a tavern standing back a distance from the road, embowered in a grove of trees between whose anxious boles the tap-room windows shone enticingly, aglow with comfortable light. A creaking sign-board, much worn by weather and age, swinging from a roadside post, confirming the accuracy of Brentwick's surmise, announcing that here stood the Crown and Mitre, house of entertainment for man and beast. Sluggishly the car rolled up before it and came to a dead and silent halt. Charles, the mechanician, jumping out, ran hastily up the path towards the inn. In the car Brentwick turned again, his eyes curiously bright in the starlight, his forehead quaintly furrowed, his voice apologetic. "It may take a few minutes," he said undecidedly, plainly endeavoring to cover up his own dark doubts. "My dear," to the girl, "if I have brought trouble upon you in this wise, I shall never earn my own forgiveness." Kirkwood stood up again, watchful, attentive to the sounds of night, but the voice of the pursuing motor car was not of their company. "I hear nothing," he announced. "You will forgive me, won't you, my dear, for causing you these few moments of needless anxiety?" pleaded the old gentleman, his tone tremulous. "As if you could be blamed," protested the girl. "You mustn't think of it that way. Fancy, what should we have done without you?" "I'm afraid I have been very clumsy," sighed Brentwick, "clumsy and impulsive. Kirkwood, do you hear anything?" "Not yet, sir." "Perhaps," suggested Brentwick a little later, "perhaps we had better alight and go up to the inn. It would be more cosy there, especially if the petrol proves hard to obtain and we have long to wait." "I should like that," assented the girl decidedly. Kirkwood nodded his approval, opened the door and jumped out to assist her, then picked up the bag and followed the pair, Brentwick leading the way with Dorothy on his arm. At the doorway of the Crown and Mitre, Charles met them, evidently seriously disturbed. "No petrol to be had here, sir," he announced reluctantly. "But the landlord will send to the next inn, a mile up the road, for some. You will have to be patient, I'm afraid, sir." "Very well. Get some one to help you push the car in from the road," ordered Brentwick. "We will be waiting in one of the private parlors." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." The mechanician touched the visor of his cap and hurried off. "Come, Kirkwood." Gently Brentwick drew the girl in with him. Kirkwood lingered momentarily on the doorstep, to listen acutely, but the wind was blowing into that quarter whence they had come, and he could hear naught save the soughing of the trees, together with an occasional burst of rude rustic laughter from the tap-room. Lifting his shoulders in dumb dismay, and endeavoring to compose his features, he entered the tavern. End of chapter 19, part 1. Recording by William Tomcho. Chapter 19, Part 2 of The Black Bag. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Tomcho. The Black Bag by Louis Joseph Vance. Chapter 19, Part 2, The Crown and Mitre. A rosy-cheeked and beaming landlady met him in the corridor, and, all bows and smiles, ushered him into a private parlour reserved for the party, immediately bustling off in a desperate flurry to secure refreshments desired by Brentwick. The girl had seated herself on one end of an extremely comfortless lounge, and was making a palpable effort to seem at ease. Brentwick stood at one of the windows, shoulders rounded and head bent, hands clasped behind his back as he peered out into the night. Kirkwood dropped the travelling bag beneath a chair the farthest removed from the doorway, and took to pacing the floor. In a corner of the room a tall grandfather's clock ticked off 10 interminable minutes. For some reason unconscionably delaying, the landlady did not reappear. Brentwick, abruptly turning from the window, remarked the fact querulously, then drew a chair up to a marble-topped table in the middle of the floor. "My dear," he requested the girl, "will you oblige me by sitting over here? And, Philip, bring up a chair, if you will. We must not permit ourselves to worry, and I have something here which may, perhaps, engage your interest for a while." To humour him and alleviate his evident distress of mind, they acceded. Kirkwood found himself seated opposite Dorothy, Brentwick between them. After some hesitation, made the more notable by an air of uneasiness which sat oddly on his shoulders, whose composure and confident mien had theretofore been so complete and so reassuring, the elder gentleman fumbled in an inner coat pocket and brought to light a small black leather wallet. He seemed to be on the point of opening it, when hurried footfalls sounded in the hallway. Brentwick placed the wallet, still with its secret intact, on the table before him, as Charles burst unceremoniously in, leaving the door wide open. "Mr. Brentwick, sir!" he cried gustily. "That other car—" With a smothered ejaculation, Kirkwood leaped to his feet, tugging at the weapon in his pocket. In another instant he had the revolver exposed. The girl's cry of alarm, interrupting the machinist, fixed Brentwick's attention on the young man. He too stood up, reaching over very quickly to clamp strong, supple fingers round Kirkwood's wrist, while with the other hand he laid hold of the revolver and by a single twist wrenched it away. Kirkwood turned upon him in fury. "So!" he cried, shaking with passion. "This is what your hospitality meant! You're going to—" "My dear young friend," interrupted Brentwick with a flash of impatience, "remember that if I had designed to betray you, I could have asked no better opportunity than when you were my guest under my own roof." "But hang it all, Brentwick!" expostulated Kirkwood, ashamed and contrite, but worked upon by desperate apprehension. "I didn't mean that. But—" "Would you have bullets flying when she is near?" demanded Brentwick scathingly. Hastily he slipped the revolver upon a little shelf beneath the table-top. "Sir," he informed Kirkwood with some heat, "I love you as my own son, but you're a young fool, as I have been in my time, and as I would to heaven I might be again. Be advised, Philip. Be calm. Can't you see it's the only way to save your treasure?" "Hang the jewels!" retorted Kirkwood warmly. "What—" "Sir, who said anything about the jewels?" As Brentwick spoke, Calendar's corpulent figure filled the doorway. Stryker's weather-worn features loomed over his shoulder, distorted in a cheerful leer. "As to the jewels," announced the fat adventurer, "I've got a word to say, if you put it to me that way." He paused on the threshold, partly for dramatic effect, partly for his own satisfaction, his quick eyes darting from face to face of the four people whom he had caught so unexpectedly. A shade of complacency colored his expression, and he smiled evilly beneath the coarse, short thatch of his grey moustache. In his hand a revolver appeared, poised for immediate use if there were need. There was none. Brentwick, at his primal appearance, had dropped a peremptory hand on Kirkwood's shoulder, forcing the young man back to his seat. At the same time he resumed his own. The girl had not stirred from hers since the first alarm. She sat as if transfixed with terror, leaning forward with her elbows on the table, her hands tightly clasped, her face, a little blanched, turned to the door. But her scarlet lips were set and firm with inflexible purpose, and her brown eyes met Calendar's with a look level and unflinching. Beyond this she gave no sign of recognition. Nearest of the four to the adventurers was Charles. The mechanician paused in affrighted astonishment at sight of the revolver. Calendar, choosing to advance suddenly, poked the muzzle of the weapon jocularly in the man's ribs. "Beat it, Four Eyes!" he snapped. "This is your cue to duck. Get out of my way!" The mechanician jumped as if shot, then hastily retreated to the table, his sallow features working beneath the goggle mask which had excited the fat adventurer's scorn. "Come right in, Captain," Calendar threw over one shoulder. "Come in, shut the door, and lock it. Let's all be sociable and have a nice, quiet time." Stryker obeyed with a derisive grimace for Kirkwood. Calendar, advancing jauntily to a point within a yard of the table, stopped, smiling affably down upon his prospective victims, and airily twirling his revolver. "Good evening, all," he saluted them blandly. "Dorothy, my child," with assumed concern, "you're looking a trifle upset. I'm afraid you've been keeping late hours. Little girls must be careful, you know, or they lose the bloom of roses in their cheeks. Mr. Kirkwood, it's a pleasure to meet you again. Permit me to paraphrase your most sound advice and remind you that pistol shots are apt to attract undesirable attention. It wouldn't be wise for you to bring the police about our ears. I believe that in substance such was your sapient counsel to me in the cabin of the Althea, was it not? And you, sir," fixing Brentwick with a cold, unfriendly eye, "you animated fossil, what do you mean by telling me to go to the devil? But let that pass. I hold no grudge. What might your name be?" "It might be Brentwick," said that gentleman placidly. "Brentwick, eh? Well, I like a man of spirit. But permit me to advise you—" "Gladly," nodded Brentwick. "Eh? Don't come a second time between father and daughter. Another man might not be as patient as I, Mr. Brentwick. There's a law in the land, if you don't happen to know it." "I congratulate you on your success in evading it," observed Brentwick, undisturbed. "And it was considerate of you not to employ it in this instance." Then, with a sharp change of tone, "Come, sir," he demanded. "You have unwarrantably intruded in this room, which I have engaged for my private use. Get through with your business, and be off with you." "All in my good time, my antediluvian friend. When I've found up my business here, I'll go. Not before. But, just to oblige you, we'll get down to it. Kirkwood, you have a revolver of mine. Be good enough to return it." "I have it here, under the table," interrupted Brentwick suavely. "Shall I hand it to you?" "By the muzzle, if you please. Be very careful. This one's loaded, too. Apt to explode any minute." To Kirkwood's intense disgust, Brentwick quietly slipped one hand beneath the table and, placing the revolver on its top, delicately with his fingertips shoved it toward the farther edge. With a grunt of approval, Calendar swept the weapon up and into his pocket. "Any more ordnance?" he inquired briskly, eyes moving alertly from face to face. "No matter. You wouldn't dare use 'em anyway. And I'm about done. Dorothy, my dear, it's high time you returned to your father's protection. Where's that Gladstone bag?" "In my traveling bag," the girl told him in a toneless voice. "Then you may bring it along. You may also say good night to the kind gentleman." Dorothy did not move. Her pallor grew more intense, and Kirkwood saw her knuckles tighten beneath the gloves. Otherwise her mouth seemed to grow more straight and hard. "Dorothy!" cried the adventurer with a touch of displeasure. "You heard me?" "I heard you," she replied a little wearily, more than a little contemptuously. "Don't mind him, please, Mr. Kirkwood." With an appealing gesture, as Kirkwood, unable to contain himself, moved restlessly in his chair, threatening to rise. "Don't say anything. I have no intention whatever of going with this man." Calendar's features twitched nervously. He chewed a corner of his moustache, fixing the girl with a black stare. "I presume," he remarked after a moment, with slow deliberation, "you're aware that, as your father, I am in a position to compel you to accompany me." "I shall not go with you," iterated Dorothy in a level tone. "You may threaten me, but I shall not go. Mr. Brentwick and Mr. Kirkwood are taking me to friends, who will give me a home until I find a way to take care of myself. That is all I have to say to you." "Bravo, my dear!" cried Brentwick encouragingly. "Mind your business, sir!" thundered Calendar, his face darkening. Then to Dorothy, "You understand, I trust, what this means?" he demanded. "I offer you a home, and a good one. Refuse, and you work for your living, my girl. You've forfeited your legacy." I know," she told him in cold disdain. "I am content. Won't you be kind enough to leave me alone?" For a breath Calendar glowered over her. Then, "I presume," he observed, "that all these heroics are inspired by that whippersnapper Kirkwood. Do you know that he hasn't a brass farthing to bless himself with?" "What has that?" cried the girl indignantly. "Why, it has everything to do with me, my child. As your doting parent, I can't consent to your marrying nothing a year. For I surmise you intend to marry this Mr. Kirkwood, don't you?" There followed a little interval of silence, while the warm blood flamed in the girl's face and the red lips trembled as she faced her tormentor. Then, with a quaver that escaped her control, "If Mr. Kirkwood asks me, I shall," she stated very simply. "That," interposed Kirkwood, "is completely understood." His gaze sought her eyes, but she looked away. "You forget that I am your father," sneered Calendar, "and that you are a minor. I can refuse my consent." "But you won't," Kirkwood told him with assurance. The adventurer stared. "No," he agreed, after slight hesitation. "No, I shan't interfere. Take her, my boy, if you want her, and a father's blessing into the bargain. The Lord knows I've troubles enough. A parent's lot is not what it's cracked up to be." He paused, leering, ironic. "But," deliberately, "there's still this matter of the Gladstone bag. I don't mind abandoning my parental authority, when my child's happiness is concerned, but as for my property—" "It is not your property," interrupted the girl. "It was your mother's, dear child. It's now mine." "I dispute that assertion," Kirkwood put in. "You may dispute it till the cows come home, my boy. The fact will remain that I intend to take my property with me when I leave this room, whether you like it or not. Now, are you disposed to continue the argument, or may I count on your being sensible?" "You may put away your revolver, if that's what you mean," said Kirkwood. "We certainly shan't oppose you with violence. But I warn you that Scotland Yard—" "Oh, that be blowed!" the adventurer snorted in disgust. "I can sail circles round any tech that ever blew out of Scotland Yard. Give me an hour's start, and you're free to do all the funny business you've a mind to with Scotland Yard." "Then you admit," queried Brentwick civilly, "that you've no legal title to the jewels in dispute?" "Look here, my friend," chuckled Calendar, "when you catch me admitting anything, you write it down in your little book and tell the bobby on the corner. Just at present I've got other business than to stand round admitting anything about anything. Captain, let's have that bag of my dutiful daughter's." "'Ere you are!" Stryker spoke for the first time since entering the room, taking the valise from beneath the chair and depositing it on the table. "Well, we shan't take anything that doesn't belong to us," laughed Calendar, fumbling with the catch. "Not even so small a matter as my own child's traveling bag. A small, heavy Gladstone bag," he grunted, opening the valise, and plunging in one greedy hand, "will just about do for mine. with which he produced the article mentioned. "This for the discard, Captain," he laughed contentedly, pushing the girl's valise aside, and, rumbling with stentorian mirth, stood beaming benignantly over the assembled company. "Why," he exclaimed, "this moment is worth all it cost me. My children, I forgive you freely. Mr. Kirkwood, I felicitate you cordially on having secured a most expensive wife. Really, do you know, I feel as if I ought to do a little something for you both." Gurgling with delight, he smote his fat palms together. "I just tell you what," he resumed, "no one yet ever called Georgie Calendar a tightwad. I just believe I'm going to make you kids a handsome wedding present. The good Lord knows there's enough of this for a fellow to be a little generous and never miss it." The thick mottled fingers tore nervously at the catch. Eventually he got the bag open. Those about the table bent forward, all quickened by the prospect of, for the first time, beholding the treasure over which they had fought, for which they had suffered so long. A heady and luscious fragrance pervaded the atmosphere, exhaling from the open mouth of the bag. A silence, indefinitely sustained, impressed itself upon the little audience. A breathless pause ended eventually by a short snap of Calendar's teeth. Grunted the adventurer in bewilderment. He began to pant. Abruptly his heavy hands delved into the contents of the bag, like the paws of a terrier digging in earth. To Kirkwood the air seemed temporarily thick with flying objects. Beneath his astonished eyes a towel fell upon the table, a crumpled, soiled towel, bearing on its dingy hem the inscription in indelible ink, "Hôtel du Commerce, Anvers." A tooth mug of substantial earthenware dropped to the floor with a crash. A slimy soap dish of the same manufacture slid across the table and into Brentwick's lap. A battered alarm clock, with never a tick left in its abused carcass, rang vacuously as it fell by the open bag. The remainder was oranges, a dozen or more small, round, golden globes of ripe fruit, perhaps a shade overripe, therefore the more aromatic. The adventurer ripped out an oath. "Mulready, by the living God!" he raged in fury. "Done up, I swear! Done by that infernal sneak! Me, blind as a bat!" He fell suddenly silent, the blood congesting in his face, as suddenly broke forth again, haranguing the company. "That's why he went out and bought those damned oranges, is it? Think of it, me sitting in the hotel in Antwerp, and him lugging in oranges by the bagful because he was fond of fruit. When did he do it? How do I know? If I knew, would I be here, and him the devil knows where, this minute? When my back was turned, of course, the damned snake! That's why he was so hot about picking a fight on the boat, eh? Wanted to get thrown off and take to the woods, leaving me with this. And that's why he felt so awful done up he wouldn't take a hand at hunting you two down, eh? Well, by the eternal, I'll camp on his trail for the rest of his natural born days. I'll have his eye teeth for this. I'll—" He swayed, gibbering with rage, his countenance frightfully contorted, his fat hands shaking as he struggled for expression. And then, while yet their own astonishment held Dorothy, Kirkwood, Brentwick, and Stryker speechless, Charles, the mechanician, moved suddenly upon the adventurer. There followed two metallic clicks. Calendar's ravings were abrupted as if his tongue had been paralyzed. He fell back a pace, flabby jowls pale and shaking, ponderous jaw dropping on his breast, mouth wide and eyes crazed as he shook violently before him his thick, fleshy wrists, securely handcuffed. Simultaneously the mechanician whirled about, bounded eagerly across the floor, and caught Stryker at the door, his dexterous fingers twisting in the captain's collar as he jerked him back and tripped him. "Mr. Kirkwood," he cried, "here, please, one moment. Take this man's gun from him, will you?" Kirkwood sprang to his assistance, and without encountering much trouble succeeded in wresting a Webley from Stryker's limp, flaccid fingers. Roughly the mechanician shook the man, dragging him to his feet. "Now," he ordered sternly, "you march to that corner, stick your nose in it, and be good. You can't get away if you try. I've got other men outside, waiting for you to come out. Understand?" Trembling like a whipped cur, Stryker meekly obeyed his instructions to the letter. The mechanician, with a contemptuous laugh leaving him, strode back to Calendar, meanwhile whipping off his goggles, and clapped a hearty hand upon the adventurer's quaking shoulders. "Well," he cried, "and are you still sailing circles round the men from Scotland Yard, Simmons or Bellows or Sanderson or Calendar or Crumstone or whatever name you prefer to sail under?" Calendar glared at him aghast, then heaved a profound sigh, shrugging his fat shoulders, and bent his head in thought. An instant later he looked up. "You can't do it," he informed the detective vehemently. "You haven't got a shred of evidence against me. What's there? A pile of oranges and a peck of trash. What of it? Besides," he threatened, "if you pinch me, you'll have to take the girl in too. I swear that whatever stealing was done, she did it. I'll not be trapped this way by her, and let her off without a squeal. Take me, take her. Do you hear?" "I think," put in the clear, bland accents of Brentwick, "we can consider that matter settled. I have here, my man," nodding to the adventurer as he took up the black leather wallet, "I have here a little matter which may clear up any lingering doubts as to your standing, which you may be disposed at present to entertain." He extracted a slip of cardboard, and, at arm's length, laid it on the table edge beneath the adventurer's eyes. The latter, bewildered, bent over it for a moment, breathing heavily, then straightened back, shook himself, laughed shortly with a mirthless note, and faced the detective. "It's come with you now, I guess," he suggested very quietly. "The barrister warrant is still out for you," returned the man. "That'll be enough to hold you on till extradition papers arrive from the States." "Oh, I'll waive those, and I won't give you any trouble either, I reckon," mused the adventurer, jingling his manacles thoughtfully. "I'm a back number anyway. When a half-grown girl, a half-baked boy, a flub like Mulready, damn his eyes, and a club-footed snipe from Scotland Yard can put it all over me this way, why, I guess it's up to me to go home and retire to my country place up the Hudson." He sighed wearily. "Yep, time to cut it out. But I would like to be free long enough to get in one good lick at that mutt Mulready. My friend, you get your hands on him, and I'll squeal on him till I'm blue in the face. That's a promise." "You'll have the chance before long," replied the detective. "We received a telegram from the Amsterdam police late this afternoon, saying they'd picked up Mr. Mulready with a woman named Hallam, and were holding them on suspicion. It seems," turning to Brentwick, "they were opening negotiations for the sale of a lot of stones, and seemed in such a precious hurry that the diamond merchant's suspicions were roused. We're sending over for them, Miss Calendar, so you can make your mind easy about your jewels. You'll have them back in a few days." "Thank you," said the girl with an effort. "Well," the adventurer delivered his peroration, "I certainly am blamed glad to hear it. 'Twouldn't have been a square deal any other way." He paused, looking his erstwhile dupes over with a melancholy eye, then, with an uncertain nod, comprehending the girl, Kirkwood, and Brentwick, "So long," he said thickly, and turned, with the detective's hand under his arm, and, accompanied by the thoroughly cowed Stryker, waddled out of the room. End of chapter 19, part 2. Recording by William Tomcho. Chapter 19, Part 3 of The Black Bag. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Tomcho. The Black Bag by Louis Joseph Vance, Chapter 19, Part 3, The Journey's End. Kirkwood, following the exodus, closed the door with elaborate care, and slowly, deep in thought, returned to the table. Dorothy seemed not to have moved, save to place her elbows on the marble slab, and rest her cheeks between hands that remained clenched, as they had been in the greatest stress of her emotion. The color had returned to her face, with a slightly enhanced depth of hue to the credit of her excitement. Her cheeks were hot, her eyes star-like beneath the woven, massy sunlight of her hair. Temporarily unconscious of her surroundings, she stared steadfastly before her, thoughts astray in the iridescent glamour of the dreams that were to come. Brentwick had slipped down in his chair, resting his silvered head upon its back, and was smiling serenely up at the low yellow ceiling. Before him on the table his long white fingers were drumming an inaudible tune. Presently rousing, he caught Kirkwood's eye and smiled sheepishly, like a child caught in innocent mischief. The younger man grinned broadly. "And you were responsible for all that," he commented, infinitely amused. Brentwick nodded, twinkling self-satisfaction. "I contrived it all," he said. "Neat, I call it, too." His old eyes brightened with reminiscent enjoyment. "Inspiration!" he crowed softly. "Inspiration, pure and simple. I'd been worrying my wits for fully 5 minutes before Wotton had it. I talked with Charles by telephone, his name is really Charles, by the by, overcame his conscientious scruples about playing his fish when they were ready all but landed, and settled the artistic details." He chuckled delightedly. "It's the instinct," he declared emphatically, "the instinct for adventure. I knew it was in me, latent somewhere, but never till this day did it get the opportunity to assert itself. A born adventurer, that's what I am. You see, it was essential that they should believe we were frightened and running from them. That way they would be sure to run after us. Why, we might have baited a dozen traps and failed to lure them into my house, after that stout scoundrel knew you'd had the chance to tell me the whole yarn. Odd." "Weren't you taking chances, you and Charles?" asked Kirkwood curiously. "Precious few. There was another motor from Scotland Yard trailing Captain Stryker's. If they had run past, or turned aside, they would have been overhauled in short order." He relapsed into his whimsical reverie. The wistful look returned to his eyes, replacing the glow of triumph and pleasure, and he sighed a little regretfully. "What I don't understand," contended Kirkwood, "is how you convinced Calendar that he couldn't get revenge by pressing his charge against Miss Calendar, Dorothy." "Oh?" Mr. Brentwick elevated his fine white eyebrows and sat up briskly. "My dear boy, that was the most delectable dish on the entire menu. I have been reserving it, I don't mind owning, that I might better enjoy the full relish of it. I may answer you best, perhaps, by asking you scan what I offered to the fat scoundrel's respectful consideration, my dear sir." He levelled a forefinger at the card. At first glance it conveyed nothing to the younger man's benighted intelligence. He puzzled over it, twisting his brows out of alignment. An ordinary oblong slip of thin white cardboard, it was engraved in fine script as follows: "Mr. George Burgoyne Calendar, 81 Aspen Villas, S.W." "Oh!" exclaimed Kirkwood at length, standing up, his face bright with understanding. "You—" "I," laconically assented the elder man. Impulsively Kirkwood leaned across the table. "Dorothy," he said tenderly, and when the girl's happy eyes met his, quietly drew her attention to the card. Then he rose hastily and went over to stand by the window, staring mistily into the blank face of night beyond its unseen panes. Behind him there was a confusion of little noises: the sound of a chair pushed hurriedly aside, a rustle of skirts, a happy sob or two, low voices intermingling, sighs. Out of it finally came his father's accents. "There, there, my dear, my dearest dear," protested the old gentleman. "Positively I don't deserve a tithe of this. I—" The young old voice quavered and broke, in a happy laugh. "You must understand," he continued more soberly, "that no consideration of any sort is due me. When we married I was too old for your mother, child. We both knew it, both believed it would never matter. But it did. By her wish I went back to America. We were to see what separation would do to heal the wounds dissension had caused. It was a very foolish experiment. Your mother died before I could return." There fell a silence, again broken by the father. After that I was in no haste to return, but some years ago I came to London to live. I communicated with the old Colonel, asking permission to see you. It was refused in a manner which precluded the subject being reopened by me. I was informed that if I persisted in attempting to see you, you would be disinherited. He was very angry with me. Justly, I admit. One must grow old before one can see how unforgivably one was wrong in youth. So I settled down to a quiet old age, determined not to disturb you in your happiness. Ah, Kirkwood!" The old gentleman was standing, his arm around his daughter's shoulders, when Kirkwood turned. "Come here, Philip. I'm explaining to Dorothy, but you should hear. The evening I called on you, dear boy, at the Pless, returning home, I received a message from my solicitors, whom I had instructed to keep an eye on Dorothy's welfare. They informed me that she had disappeared. Naturally, I cancelled my plans to go to Munich, and stayed, employing detectives. One of the first things they discovered was that Dorothy had run off with an elderly person calling himself George Burgoyne Calendar, the name I had discarded when I found that to acknowledge me would imperil my daughter's fortune. The investigations went deeper. Charles, let us continue to call him, had been to see me only this afternoon, to inform me of the plot they had discovered. This Hallam woman and her son, it seems that they were legitimately in the line of inheritance. Dorothy out of the way. But the woman was a bad lot. Somehow she got into communication with this fat rogue, and together they plotted it out. Charles doesn't believe that the Hallam woman expected to enjoy the Burgoyne estates for very many days. Her plan was to step in when Dorothy stepped out, gather up what she could, realize on it, and decamp. That is why there was so much excitement about the jewels. Naturally, the most valuable item on her list, the most easy to convert into cash. The man Mulready we do not place. He seems to have been a shady character the fat rogue picked up somewhere. The latter's ordinary line of business was diamond smuggling, though he would condescend to almost anything in order to turn a dishonest penny. That seems to exhaust the subject. But one word more. Dorothy, I am old enough and have suffered enough to know the wisdom of seizing one's happiness when one may. My dear, a little while ago you did a very brave deed. Under fire you said a most courageous, womanly, creditable thing. And Philip's rejoinder was only second in nobility to yours. I do hope to goodness that you two blessed youngsters won't let any addle-pated scruples stand between yourselves and the prize of romance, your inalienable inheritance." Abruptly Brentwick, who was no longer Brentwick, but the actual Calendar, released the girl from his embrace and hopped nimbly toward the door. "Really, I must see about that petrol," he cried. "While it's perfectly true that Charles lied about its running out, we must be getting on. I'll call you when we're ready to start." And the door crashed to behind him. Between them was the table. Beyond it the girl stood with head erect, dim tears glimmering on the lashes of those eyes with which she met Philip's steady gaze so fearlessly. Singing about them, the silence deepened. Fascinated though his heart was faint with longing, Kirkwood faltered on the threshold of his kingdom. "Dorothy, you did mean it, dear?" She laughed, a little, low, sobbing laugh that had its source deep in the hidden sanctuary of her heart of a child. "I meant it, my dearest. If you'll have a girl so bold and forward, who can't wait till she's asked but throws herself into the arms of the man she loves, Philip, I meant it, every word." And as he went to her swiftly, round the table, she turned to meet him, arms uplifted, her scarlet lips a-tremble, the brown and bewitching lashes drooping over her wondrously lighted eyes. After a time Philip Kirkwood laughed aloud. And there was that quality in the ring of his laughter that caused the shade of care, which had for the past 10 minutes been uneasily luffing and filling in the offing, and, on the whole, steadily diminishing and becoming more pale and wan and emaciated and indistinct. There was that in the laughter of Philip Kirkwood, I say, which caused the Shade of Care to utter a hollow croak of despair as incontinently it vanished out of his life. End of Chapter 19, Part 3. Recording by William Tomcho. End of The Black Bag by Louis Joseph Vance.